I died on a Tuesday. Not heroically, not in battle, not doing something meaningful or poetic or worth putting on a headstone. I just stopped. One moment I was sitting at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet that meant nothing, and the next moment I wasn't anywhere at all. No light at the end of a tunnel, no life flashing before my eyes. No dramatic final words, just nothing. A clean, complete, absolute nothing that felt honestly like the best sleep I'd had in years. And then, annoyingly, I existed again. I say annoyingly because existence came back with all the subtlety of a freight train. Loud, overwhelming, impossible to ignore, and different. Fundamentally, structurally, cosmically different from anything I had ever experienced before in my life. My name was Kale, formerly human, 31 years old, mid-level data analyst at a company whose name I'm already forgetting. I owned a one-bedroom apartment in a city I'd moved to for a job and never left. I had 3 friends, one of whom I only kept in contact with because we were in a group chat. I had a sad succulent on my windowsill that I killed within 3 weeks of purchasing it. The packaging said succulents were impossible to kill. The packaging lied. Or I was uniquely incompetent, probably both. And now, current status, enormous. Embarrassingly, incomprehensibly, geologically enormous. I don't know how long the transformation took. That's the first thing you lose when you become something of this scale. Time stops being a thing that happens to you and starts being a thing you observe from the outside. Could have been hours. Could have been centuries. Time gets slippery when your body is becoming a landscape. Days blur together, centuries pass like slow weather. When I finally became aware of myself in any coherent sense, I was lying on my back, arms at my sides, legs extended, like a man who had decided to take a very relaxing nap and had accidentally become a mountain range in the process. My body stretched in every direction for what felt like miles. And I mean that literally, not as a figure of speech, literally miles. I focused on my right hand and tried to understand what I was feeling. Sensation came back slowly, like a limb waking up from being asleep, except the limb was the size of a small country. I felt stone, cold, ancient stone pressing against my palm. I felt wind moving across the ridges of my knuckles. I felt the faint, distant sensation of something liquid. Water, I realized, running in a thin line along the crease of my index finger. A creek. There was a creek running along my finger. I lay there with that information for a while. Then I tried to move. Specifically, I tried to wiggle my fingers. Just a small, careful test. 3 valleys collapsed. I felt it happen. The deep, slow, grinding shift of earth as my tendons flexed beneath the stone that had formed over them somewhere. To my northwest, a hillside that had been a hillside for probably 10,000 years simply decided it was done being a hillside. The sound of it reached me as a faint vibration through the stone. From any human perspective, it must have been catastrophic. I stopped wiggling my fingers. I tried more cautiously to sit up. Just a slight adjustment. Just enough to get a better look around. The horizon shifted. Not metaphorically. Actually shifted. The line where the sky met the earth tilted several degrees. Whatever was resting on my chest, and something was definitely resting on my chest, heavy and complex and layered, shifted with it. I lay back down immediately. I exhaled. Just once, slowly and carefully, through what I was increasingly certain was an enormous and geologically significant nose. Somewhere far below me and to the south, an entire forest bent like grass in a sudden wind. Okay. I lay in the dark behind my own closed eyes and processed the situation. New life rule number 1, do not move. New life rule number 2, also do not breathe too hard or too suddenly. New life rule number 3, before doing anything at all, think about every possible consequence and then think about it again. I stared at the sky. The sky stared back. It looked smaller than I remembered, closer, like someone had hung it at the wrong distance from my face. Clouds drifted past my nose, not in the distance, directly past my nose. Actual clouds, real and cold and wet, scraping across my face the way fog scrapes across a cliff. I couldn't feel pain. That was interesting. I tested it carefully, running a mental inventory of my new body. No pain, no cold, no hunger, no thirst, nothing that I recognized as physical discomfort. Just this massive, overwhelming, impossible weight of existing. This sense of being present in a way that filled the entire world. And silence. God, the silence. No people, no traffic, no noise of any civilization, just wind and the faint distant sound of water moving somewhere below me. That water was running along my shin, I realized after a while. A river, an actual river, following the contour of my leg. I lay there with that information for considerably longer than I lay with the creek on my finger. A river, running down my shin. I was a geographical feature. I was the kind of thing that got named on maps, a permanent feature, something that required its own cartographic notation. In my old life, and I was already beginning to think of it as my old life, which says something about how thoroughly the universe had committed to this transformation, I had been nobody special. The desk job, the small apartment, the 3 friends and the group chat and the succulent I couldn't keep alive. I had been, by every measurable standard, an ordinary person living an ordinary life in an ordinary mid-sized city, contributing a modest and entirely forgettable amount to the world before exiting quietly and without any fanfare at all. And now I was a titan, a genuine, geological, miles-long titan lying in the dark somewhere on a planet that I was already physically altering just by existing. The universe has a real sense of humor, a specific, targeted, deeply personal sense of humor aimed squarely at people who spent their lives being told they had potential. I lay there for a long time after that, just breathing, carefully, slowly, with maximum awareness of every exhale, and trying to understand my situation. The first thing I needed to accept was that I could not move, not freely, not without consequence for everything living near me. Every small motion of my body would register as an earthquake for anything living near me. Every large motion would be a catastrophe. I had tested this already with the finger wiggle and the collapsed valleys. I had no desire to run further experiments. The second thing I needed to accept was that I was probably here for a very, very long time, an indefinite time. Possibly forever. I didn't feel hungry. I didn't feel tired. I didn't feel any of the biological urgencies that had structured every single day of my human life, which meant this body could exist indefinitely, which meant I was facing an eternity of lying still in the dark, unable to move, slowly becoming part of the landscape. That thought sat in my chest, which was approximately the size of a small mountain range, for a while. Then I decided to do the only thing available to me. I decided to pay attention. If I couldn't move, I would observe. If I couldn't act, I would know. I would spend whatever time I had learning everything there was to know about the world I was lying in. I focused my senses outward, slowly, carefully, the way you'd open a window in a house you weren't sure about. The world came in gradually. First, the geology of my immediate surroundings, the weight and texture of stone and earth against every surface of my body. Then the weather, the patterns of wind and rain and temperature change that moved across me over what I was beginning to understand were seasons. Then, faintly, at the very edge of perception, life, plants first, the slow, patient, non-urgent growth of roots finding their way into the earth around me. Then insects, then larger animals. The world was not empty. The world was full and busy and completely unaware of what it was living near. The first century was the hardest, not because of pain or physical discomfort, because of boredom, total and absolute and crushing. Absolute, crushing, total boredom of a kind that only a being with infinite time and zero ability to act could truly understand. I had nothing to do. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't interact with anything. I could only observe. And in the first century, there wasn't much to observe. Animals, weather, the slow change of seasons. I counted seasons for a while. Then I lost count somewhere in the 800s and decided counting wasn't helping. I thought about my old life obsessively in those early centuries. Ran every memory I had like film reels in a dark theater, the desk job, the commute, the group chat, a woman I had almost asked out once and then didn't, my mother calling on Sundays. Ordinary things, unremarkable things, things I had barely noticed while they were happening, and now replayed with aching, precise detail because they were all I had. I twitched my left knee once in what I believe was my first year, not intentionally. A reflex, the kind of thing the body does without consulting the mind. The results were immediate and dramatic. The kneecap shifted, the earth above it buckled. A ridge that had existed since before I arrived there simply opened up and became a valley. Whatever animals had been living in that valley were now living somewhere else, if they were lucky, or not living at all if they were not. I lay very still after that for what felt like a long time and thought seriously about how to exist in this body without destroying everything around me. The answer, as far as I could determine, was extremely carefully, and with the constant awareness that everything I was had consequences for everything around me. I watched seasons pass. I felt snow settle on my chest and melt in spring. I felt summer heat bake the stone that had formed across my skin. I felt autumn rain running in channels along my collarbone. I felt the weight of centuries piling up like sediment. The world above me was changing. Forests grew and died and grew again. Riverbeds shifted. The geography of the region rearranged itself slowly around my presence. Gradually, very gradually, over decades, I stopped thinking about my old life and started thinking seriously about this one. By year 50, something changed in the world around me. The silence ended. Not completely, not dramatically, just differently. It started with a faint pressure near my left ankle, something rhythmic, consistent, not natural in the way wind or water was natural. Deliberate, the vibration of something deliberate pressing against my skin. I focused every bit of perception I had on that ankle and spent 3 weeks trying to understand what I was feeling. It took that long because I was being cautious. I was determined not to react until I understood. I was not going to twitch a knee again. When I finally understood what I was feeling down there, I went very still in a completely different way than before. People, small, warm, alive, busy people, were at my ankle. They were moving in patterns. They were using tools. They were building. Actual human beings, or something close enough to human beings that the difference didn't matter, had found the ridge of my ankle and decided it was an excellent place to start a settlement. I held my breath. Metaphorically, of course, because actual breathing would have ended the settlement before it properly began. They were building a wall. I could feel the individual impacts of tools against stone, one after another, methodical and rhythmic and purposeful, using my ankle as a foundation, setting their first stones directly against the surface of my skin, trusting it completely. I didn't know whether to be moved or horrified. I cycled through several emotions before landing eventually on a kind of stunned tenderness that I hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. These tiny, brave, completely oblivious people had found me lying in the dark and decided I was useful. That I was theirs. They had no idea. They genuinely had no idea what they were building on. They thought I was stone. Old stone, unusual stone, perfectly shaped stone, but stone. A gift, maybe, a lucky formation. A good place to build. I lay there and watched them build and felt something I hadn't felt in 50 years of lying alone in the dark. I felt company. They called themselves the Verret. I learned their name the slow way, by listening to their language for decades as it developed from simple calls and signals into something complex, and they were short and dark-haired and they worked constantly. From the vibrations of their movement, I could tell they were organized. Work parties, separate tasks, a structure to their activity. They expanded their wall. They built inside it. They brought more people. The settlement grew. By year 100, they had a city. Not a large city, not yet, but a real one, with streets that followed the natural lines of my tendons, with homes carved into the curve of my ankle bone. They built a central market square positioned directly over what I was fairly confident was my own Achilles heel, which felt thematically appropriate, in a way that suggested the universe was still paying attention to me specifically. Their king's name was Reborn III. I learned this because they had started making monuments, carving things into stone, including the large flat stones that happened to be parts of my outer ankle, and I had gotten quite good at reading carved text through vibration alone. Reborn III was, by all accounts, a perfectly average king. Not cruel, not visionary, not particularly memorable in any direction. The kind of king who fills a reign without defining it. He collected taxes. He built roads. Or rather, he had roads built, which is what kings do. He started a small war with a neighboring tribal group over grazing rights. He lost that war. He called it a strategic withdrawal and had the monument describing it carved in language so oblique that it took me several readings to understand what had actually happened. As kings do, I didn't intervene in any of this. I wasn't entirely sure what intervention would even look like, given that my smallest available action was approximately the size of a natural disaster. So I watched. I listened. I stayed very, very still. And I got to know the Verret in the way you get to know a neighborhood from inside a building, through sound and vibration and the patterns of daily life. The city grew. By year 200, they had expanded north along my calf. By 300, they had reached my knee. They were industrious in a way that I found genuinely impressive. Every natural feature of my body that they encountered, they turned into something useful. The ridge of my kneecap became their citadel, the high defensive point from which the whole lower city could be observed and protected. The hollow behind my knee, where water had been pooling for as long as I could remember, they dammed and channeled and called the Lake of Endless Blessing. I tried not to think too hard about that name, about what was blessing them and how, and whether the priests who named it understood the irony. By year 400, things got philosophically interesting. Religion had been building in the Verret culture for a long time. They had always had stories about the ground beneath their feet, the great stone ancestor, the being of foundation, the eternal ridge that the gods had placed there to protect the faithful. But in year 400, a priest arrived. His name was Doreth. I know this because he introduced himself loudly and publicly on the steps of the citadel to approximately everyone in the city. Doreth was a man with the specific energy of someone who has recently had what he believes is a revelation, buzzing with it, overflowing. He climbed to the top of the citadel, my kneecap, and stood there with his arms raised to the sky and declared, in a voice that carried clearly down through the stone to wherever I was paying attention, that the god himself was sleeping beneath their feet. Technically accurate. 10 out of 10 on the facts. He lost me at the next part. Because Adoreth then said, still in that same carrying voice to a crowd that was listening with growing intensity, that one day the god would wake, that when the god woke, he would rise from the earth. And when he rose, he would carry the Verret up to heaven on his shoulders. I wanted to interrupt, very badly wanted to interrupt. Because the rising to heaven part was deeply, dangerously wrong, and I was the only one who knew it. If I stood up, if I actually rose from the ground, slowly or quickly or in any manner at all, the Verret weren't going to heaven. They were going sideways at very high speed into whatever geography existed 20 miles to the east of my body. The physics of it were unavoidable. 500,000 people living on my body would not survive me, standing up any more than passengers, survive a ship suddenly turning itself vertical in open ocean. I could not hold a press conference. I could not carve a correction into the citadel walls. I could not send a note. So Doroth's religion spread, and I lay there, being worshipped by people who were counting on me to do the one thing that would definitely kill them, and I hoped very hard that nobody decided to test the prophecy anytime soon. The temple they built over my kneecap was genuinely beautiful. I could feel it in the way you feel a warm hand resting against your skin. The weight of carved stone, carefully placed. The weight of offerings left at the base. The weight, somehow heaviest of all, of people kneeling. All of that weight felt different from the weight of buildings or streets or market stalls. It felt intentional, directed. I thought about that a lot in the years after Doroth, about what it meant to be the object of faith without being able to acknowledge it. I started paying more attention to individuals, not the kings and the priests who shaped the public life of the city, the ordinary ones. There was a woman in the Reservoir District, on the area around the Lake of Endless Blessing, who woke every morning before dawn and walked to the edge of the lake and fished. Same spot, every day. She fished in that same spot for 40 years without missing a single dawn, regardless of weather or politics. She fished through a drought that lasted 3 years and reduced the lake to less than half its normal depth. She fished through a flood that raised it so high, the water lapped at the lowest streets. She fished anyway. At dawn, before the city woke, the prohibition presumably not applying to people who woke earlier than it was being enforced. I called her the Fisher because I never learned her name. She never carved anything. She never made any speeches. She just stood at the edge of the Lake of Endless Blessing every morning before the sun rose and dropped a line into the water and waited. 40 years of that. And one morning she simply didn't come. And the morning after. And the morning after that. Gone. I noticed her absence the way you notice when a sound you've gotten used to stops. The mornings felt different for a while. She never knew the lake was water that had pooled in the back of my knee. I hoped the fish were good. I genuinely, deeply hoped that. There was a boy in the market district who climbed the same building every evening to watch the sunset. He did this for about 12 years before he presumably grew up and stopped. There was a stonemason in the Citadel district who spent 7 years carving a single doorframe. 7 years. One doorframe. Perfect. The craftsmanship was so precise and so particular in its pressure that I could feel the difference between his work and every other mason in the city. There was an old man in the northern quarter who argued with his neighbors every single day. Same arguments, different days. The rhythm of the disputes was as regular as weather. These were my people, not in any sense of ownership or control, but in the deep sense of proximity and accumulated time. But in the sense that I had come to know them the way you know family, through proximity and time and the thousand small vibrations of their ordinary lives. By year 500, the Verret had become something genuinely remarkable. 6 cities on my body, 14 towns, hundreds of villages connected by roads that followed the natural channels between my tendons, a population that I estimated at roughly 500,000 people, though I had no way to count accurately, a civilization with art and law and religion and agriculture and trade and war and all the other things that civilizations develop when left to themselves for 5 centuries. They had mapped me, in their way, not knowing what they were mapping. They thought they were mapping the sacred highlands, the blessed terrain, but they had names for every significant feature. The Great Iron Cliff, my ribs, the western ridge, the edge of my left thigh, the Valley of Whispers, the hollow of my armpit, which produced wind patterns that the Verret found eerie and sacred, the Deepwater Sea, a shallow inland depression that had formed at the small of my back and collected rainwater until it was genuinely lake-sized. Each named feature had its own mythology, its own guardians, its own sacred history. I had become, without intending to, an entire cosmology. Year 512. That's the year I heard the sound from outside. Not from the Verret, not from any of the animals or weather patterns I'd spent centuries mapping. From outside. From beyond the eastern ridge, the ridge the Verret called the Great Iron Cliff, the ridge that was my hip, came something new. I felt it before I heard it. A pressure change, subtle at first, exactly the way weather changes before a coming storm. A shift in the quality of the silence beyond my perimeter. Something that felt very faintly at first, and then with growing certainty, like displacement. Something was moving. Something large was moving through the world in my direction, and the earth was moving with it. I focused every sense I had on the eastern horizon. All the perception I'd spent 500 years developing. It took 3 full days of careful, continuous attention before I could identify what I was hearing. Footsteps? Enormous footsteps. Not the footsteps of a human or an animal or any creature I had encountered in my 5 full centuries of careful listening. Something else. Something that put its foot down and felt the ground compress beneath it, the way the ground compressed beneath me when I breathed. Another Titan. Something exactly like me in scale and fundamental nature was walking toward us through the empty and featureless eastern world. My first reaction was relief, so sharp it almost made me move. Finally, something my size. Something that would understand what it meant to exist at this scale. My second reaction arrived approximately half a second later and was composed entirely of dread, cold and absolute and heavy. Because in 500 years of lying still, I had become responsible for 500,000 people who had no idea they were living on a living thing, who called my body sacred terrain, who had built their entire civilization on the assumption that I was simply very reliable stone. And something enormous was walking toward us, something purposeful and colossal that didn't know the Verret existed at all, that didn't know I existed. That was simply walking, the way a person walks through a field, not thinking about the individual blades of grass. I held every part of myself absolutely still and directed every prayer I was capable of to whatever had turned me into a geological feature in the first place, that the other Titan was just passing through, that it was heading somewhere else and would continue past without incident. The footsteps got louder, the vibrations strengthened, and then the Verret noticed. I felt the change move through the cities on my body like a wave. The rhythms of daily life, and the market noise, and the construction work, and the temple bells, and the children running, all of it disrupted at once. The vibrations shifted from the familiar patterns of ordinary existence to something faster and sharper and more erratic. Fear. Citywide, population-wide, collective fear. From their perspective, the eternal and God-touched homeland that had never failed them was beginning to shake. The priests interpreted the shaking immediately and loudly. Of course they did. Dorath's tradition had trained them for exactly this. Earthquakes meant the god was stirring. Stirring meant the prophecy was activating. The end times were beginning and the faithful needed to prepare. The temple bells rang out across all 6 cities simultaneously. I could feel the reverberations moving through the stone. Boron the Ninth, the current king, a man whose name I had come to know through his aggressive construction projects and his habit of carving his own name on everything, called a council of war. I felt the gathering in the citadel on my kneecap, the weight of it. Armored men assembling in the highest defensive point, preparing to fight something they couldn't see. They didn't have the elevation to see what was coming. The horizon, from their perspective, was the ridge of my stomach. From my elevated perspective, I could see everything. What I saw, rising over the eastern ridge of my hip, was simply enormous, larger than the Verret's largest city, larger than the entire stretch of civilization they had built across my lower body, moving with the slow, inexorable purpose of something that had not yet encountered a reason to stop, and heading directly, with the indifferent accuracy of geography, toward the eastern settlements. The settlements the Verret called the cities of the Great Iron Cliff, the settlements carved into the bones of my ribs, the most ancient part of the Verret civilization, the oldest temples, the most sacred ground, 400 years of continuous habitation, 200,000 people. I had a decision to make. I could stay still. I could do what I had done for 500 years. Let events unfold and trust that the other Titan would pass, or would notice the settlements, or would stop for some reason I couldn't predict. Or I could move. I could rise. Partially, carefully, enough to shift the eastern face of my body, enough to put something between the approaching threat and the rib settlements, which would also destroy the rib settlements, because putting my body in a different position would mean everything on my body occupying a very different position, very suddenly, with consequences that 200,000 people would not survive. Save them by moving, kill them in the process, or do nothing and watch what was coming reach them. I lay in the dark with that calculation and felt something I hadn't felt in 500 years. Not fear. I didn't have the same relationship to personal danger that I'd had as a human. Something more complicated. The weight of knowing that everything I did and everything I didn't do had consequences for 500,000 lives that trusted me absolutely without knowing they were trusty. I thought about the fisher and her 40 years at the edge of the lake of endless blessing every morning before dawn. About Dorath's prophecy, the one I had spent 400 years quietly dreading, that said one day the god would rise and carry the Verret to safety. About the stonemason and his 7-year doorframe, about the boy who watched sunsets, about what it means to become responsible for something that grew without your permission and became. The other Titan took another step east. The ground shook with it. The cities on my body shook too, all 6 of them. In a town called Vestmark, carved into the cartilage of my 8th rib, a woman who had been asleep woke up suddenly convinced that the world was ending. She was not entirely wrong about the general situation. She was wrong about the specifics of how it would unfold. I made my choice. And I will tell you honestly, it was the single hardest decision I had made across 500 years of lying completely still. I had once spent 3 weeks deciding whether to sneeze. That had been simple by comparison. Drop a comment below if you've been here from the start. Whose side do you think I'm going to take? I read every single one. But before I tell you what I chose, and I will tell you every detail of it, let me tell you properly about the 5 full centuries that built slowly and inevitably toward that single impossible moment. Because the choice didn't come from nowhere. The choice came from 500 years of watching and listening and learning what it meant to be what I had become. Let me tell you about the year 243 specifically, when the Verret fought their very first civil war. It started, as civil wars often do, over something that seemed small on the surface and was enormous underneath. The northern cities, the ones along my upper calf and lower thigh, had developed a different form of the religion from the southern cities near my ankle. The southern tradition, Dorath's tradition, believed the sleeping god would rise and carry them upward. Transcendence, ascension, liberation from the earth. The northern tradition, which had developed independently over a century of relative isolation and then began pushing back against the south, believed something different. They believed the god was not sleeping. They believed the god was watching, present and aware and observing everything the Verret did. They believed the trembles in the earth were not signs of impending awakening but communications, the god responding, the god commenting on their behavior, which, to be clear, was also technically accurate, just not in the way they meant it. The Civil War lasted 11 years. I spent 11 years feeling armies march across my body. The sensation was deeply strange. The organized vibration of thousands of armed people moving in formation, the sharp percussion of battles, the horrible stillness of the aftermath. I stayed still throughout all of it. What else could I do? I could not separate the factions or intervene or explain. I could feel every death, in the sense that I could feel the sudden absence of a familiar vibration, a pattern of movement that had existed and then didn't. 11 years. The war ended, not because one side won, but because a drought hit both sides simultaneously, and surviving the weather became more urgent than winning the argument. They came to a theological compromise that I found impressive in its ingenuity. The god was both watching and sleeping, present but resting, aware but not intervening. They had, without knowing it, described my situation exactly. Year 307 brought the plague. I don't know where it came from. I couldn't diagnose it. I could only feel its effects through the patterns of movement across my body. The vibrations of a healthy city have a particular rhythm, the constant hum of people going about their lives, work and trade and argument and celebration, all mixing together into a baseline noise. The plague changed that rhythm entirely, slowed it, thinned it out. In the very worst months, entire districts fell completely silent. The market, in the ankle quarter, a constant chorus of activity for 2 full centuries, simply went quiet, week after week. I felt that silence the way you feel the absence of a sound you've gotten used to, like the world had skipped a beat. The Verret lost perhaps 1/3 of their population to that plague. I had no way to count precisely, but the difference in the weight and vibration of the cities when it was over was unmistakable. They rebuilt after the plague. Of course they rebuilt. The Verret were survivors in the most fundamental and stubborn sense possible. Within 20 years, the cities were as loud as they had ever been. Within 50 years, they had expanded to fill in the losses and then exceed them. Within a century, they were thriving again, and the plague had passed into mythology as the time of divine testing, during which the god had, interpretations varied, either punished the unfaithful, tested the faithful, or simply been asleep and missed the whole thing. I thought about that last interpretation more than the others. Year 380 brought something new. A woman named Sarah climbed higher than any Verret had ever climbed before. She was a temple scholar from the citadel on my kneecap. Young, I estimated her in her mid-20s based on the lightness of her footfall. She climbed the western face of the citadel where no path had been built, using cracks in the stone as handholds. I felt her hands moving across my skin with deliberate, careful precision. She reached the summit of the kneecap, a height that no Verret had reached before, and I felt her standing there, very still, for a long time. I don't know what she was searching for. I don't know what she saw from up there, standing at the very top of my kneecap. I know that when she climbed back down, the quality of her movement had changed. Lighter, somehow, or maybe heavier in a different way. She spent the next 40 years writing. I know this because her writing tools had a distinctive vibration, a specific rhythm of inscribing text into clay tablets that I could distinguish from all other work. She wrote constantly, incessantly. For 40 years, in a room near the top of the citadel, she inscribed her thoughts into clay. I don't know what she wrote. I couldn't read the tablets. Only things carved directly into me were available to me that way. But I thought about her often. about what a person who had stood at the top of my kneecap and felt the world stretching in every direction would write for 40 years afterward. Maybe she had sensed something. Maybe she had felt, standing up there, that the stone beneath her feet was different from stone. Maybe she had been the first one to wonder. Year 450, the Verret made contact with another civilization. This was new. In 450 years of their existence, the Verret had always assumed they were essentially alone, the only people in the world who mattered, living on the only terrain that was sacred. The other people came from the west, far west, over the horizon of what the Verret didn't know was my left shoulder. They were different in appearance, different in language, different in their gods and their customs and their way of building. But they were people, unmistakably, recognizably people, warm and complex and full of the same vibrations of daily life that I had spent centuries learning to love. The Verret's first reaction was hostility. The strangers were on sacred ground. Their presence near the god's body was a violation. There were skirmishes, small conflicts at the western edge of the Verret settlements. I felt them as sharp, brief disturbances in the usual pattern. Then, slowly, over decades, something else. Trade, communication, the gradual grudging recognition that the strangers had things the Verret wanted, and the Verret had things the strangers wanted. The Western people called themselves the Torath. By year 480, Torath merchants had stalls in the ankle market. By year 500, the Torath had established permanent neighborhoods in 3 of the 6 Verret cities on my body. I found this development enormously comforting. The Verret had been becoming insular, turned inward, focused on the sacred terrain, increasingly suspicious of anything beyond its edges. The Torath pushed back against that, brought new ideas, new stories, new ways of thinking about the world. The Verret resisted. Of course they resisted. But they also gradually absorbed. By year 500, the Verret language had Torath loanwords. Verret cooking had Torath ingredients. The religion, which had been absolutely rigid and fixed, had begun quietly to flex. I lay beneath all of this and felt it like weather feels, complex and changing and alive. Year 502, a child was born in the market district whose footsteps I noticed immediately. I don't know why. There was nothing objectively different about this child. The vibrations of their movement were like any child's, but something in the pattern caught my attention. A quality of presence, a particular way of navigating space that seemed, from my perspective, unusually deliberate for someone so small. I followed that child's vibrations for years, watched them grow, watched the footsteps change from the random bouncing energy of childhood to the more purposeful movement of adolescence, and then early adulthood, and then I gradually lost track of them entirely in the general noise and constant movement of the expanding city. By year 510, the young person was a priest in the northern temple, one of the tradition that believed the god was watching. They led ceremonies, I could feel that, the organized weight of gathered worshippers, the rhythmic call and response of ritual. But they also, outside the ceremonies, spent time alone on the high places, the citadel summit, the ridge of the northern cliff, anywhere high enough to see far, standing still for long periods in complete silence, not praying in any formal sense, just present and attending to something. I thought this young priest might be the closest thing to understanding me that any Verret had ever achieved, not knowing, but oriented in the right direction. It was this priest who, in year 512, was standing on the highest point of the citadel when the eastern horizon began to move. I know this because I felt their sudden stillness. Everyone in the citadel was moving, soldiers preparing, officials gathering, servants running messages. This one person went completely and absolutely still, standing right at the edge of the summit, looking steadily east, at the same thing I was looking at. What was coming from the east was not, I should clarify, what the Verret thought it was. They thought the trembling ground meant the god was waking. Some of them thought it was the beginning of the promised ascension. Some of them thought it was judgment. It was neither. It was something completely outside their cosmology. Something that made their cosmology, for all its centuries of development, deeply inadequate for describing reality. It was simply walking, moving through the world the way a person moves through a room, without particular attention to what might be on the floor. From the pattern of its movement, I could make some assessments. It was larger than me. Not dramatically larger, but the displacement it caused was greater, the footfalls heavier. It was moving consistently, same direction, same pace, no deviations that suggested it was tracking anything or following a specific path. It was not, as far as I could tell, aware of me. If it had been aware of me, it would have changed course, or stopped. The Rib settlements were, in many ways, the heart of Verret civilization, the oldest continuously inhabited ground they had. The temples there predated even Dorath. The population density was higher in the Rib cities than anywhere else. The natural cave formations in the cartilage had made housing easy to create, and over 4 centuries, those caves had been expanded and connected into an elaborate underground city that existed largely beneath the surface, which meant that from above, From the perspective of something walking across the landscape, the rib settlements would be nearly invisible. The other Titan would have no way of knowing they were there. It would simply walk, and the rib settlements would cease to exist. I lay there with this understanding and felt something shift inside me. Not decision exactly, not yet. More like the feeling of something becoming clear that had been uncertain before. The world was about to change. The question was only how. If I stayed still, the change would come from outside. The other Titan would reach my ribs, and 200,000 people would experience what it felt like to be in the path of something that didn't notice them. If I moved, the change would come from inside, from me, and the people I moved to protect would be destroyed by the protection. Unless I could find a genuine third option, something between total stillness and the full catastrophic motion of rising completely. A smaller movement, targeted, something that might redirect rather than destroy. I began, for the first time in 500 years, to think seriously about what I could do, not what I should avoid doing, what I could actually do, deliberately and with intent. I started with what I knew about my body. 5 centuries of lying still had given me an extensive understanding of my own geography. I knew which parts of me could shift without destabilizing the settlements above them. I knew the load-bearing relationships, which movements would ripple upward and which would be absorbed by intervening mass. I knew that my right arm had no settlements on it. The varette had never expanded that far. The eastern geography was too exposed, too difficult, and the arm had always been oriented in a direction that offered less natural shelter. My right arm was essentially empty terrain. 500 years of weather and growth had passed over it, but no people had settled. If I moved my right arm, slowly over days or weeks, not in a sudden motion, I might be able to position it on the eastern side of my body, between the approaching Titan and my ribs. Not a wall, not a barrier, just presence. Just the communication that something was already here, that this terrain was occupied, that there was a reason to change course. Whether the other Titan would understand that communication was a different question. Whether it would care was another question entirely. But it was a third option. Not certain, not safe, not a guarantee of anything. But it was something other than stillness or destruction. And that was more than I'd had a moment before. The young priest on the Citadel summit was still standing absolutely still, looking east when I began, slowly, with more deliberateness than I had applied to any motion in 500 years, to consider moving my right arm. The decisions you make after centuries of stillness carry a particular weight. You've had so long to think, so long to consider, and still you can't be certain. I wasn't certain. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't certain it would work. I wasn't certain the other Titan would notice or care. I wasn't certain my arm's movement wouldn't cause its own disasters. I was only certain that doing nothing was a choice, too. That staying still was a decision, with consequences just as real and just as heavy as any motion I could make. 500 years had made me many things. A landscape, a cosmology, an accidental god worshipped by people who had no idea. But lying there in the last moments before everything changed, I was mostly just a person who had watched 500,000 strangers become, without asking permission, the most important thing in his world. The other Titan took another step. The rib cities shook. The temple bells rang out in frequencies that weren't prayer. The young priest on the citadel turned slowly, looking across the lower cities, and I thought, from the particular stillness of their posture, that they were beginning to understand something. Not everything, but something real and significant. A new orientation toward understanding. Then I started moving my arm, just barely, just the faintest suggestion of motion, so slow that even I couldn't feel it as movement exactly. Just a change in intention that would, over days, become something real. 500 years of practice at stillness applied now in reverse. Every skill I developed at existing without consequence, used now in careful reverse to move with the most possible intentional consequence and the absolute minimum collateral destruction. This is how it began. Not with a roar, not with a cataclysm, with the quietest possible intention. The world's largest being trying for the first time to be gentle. If you stayed with me all the way to the end, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done. Because honestly, even now, I'm not sure I chose right. Moving my arm took 11 days. 11 days to shift something the size of a mountain range by approximately 3 degrees. 3 degrees. In my old life, 3 degrees was the kind of adjustment you made when parallel parking. Something you did without thinking in 2 seconds, while also checking your mirrors. As a Titan, 3 degrees was an event, an era, a thing that required planning and patience and a level of physical awareness I hadn't known I possessed. I moved one muscle at a time, literally. I found each individual component of my arm and activated it in sequence so slowly that the motion was closer to intention than action. The Verret felt it anyway. Of course they did. Even the most careful motion of something my size registered as geological activity to anything living on it. The first day, the eastern settlements reported minor tremors. Nothing unusual. The rib cities had always sat on what the Verret considered seismically active ground. The second day, the tremors were more regular. Rhythmic. A pattern that any observant person might notice was different from the randomness of natural earth movement. The third day, the young priest from the Citadel summit climbed to the highest accessible point of the eastern cliff and stood there for 6 hours. I know this because I felt their weight. Distinctive, particular, unmistakable after years of attention, moving steadily upward and then going completely still at the peak. They were listening. In the same way I had spent 5 centuries learning to listen, this person was doing the same thing in reverse, trying to hear the stone. I couldn't communicate directly. I had no language that translated down to their scale, but I was aware with a clarity that felt almost painful that this person was trying. On the 4th day, the young priest began carving. I felt the deliberate percussion of a tool against the eastern cliff face, my rib, in short, precise sequences. Not random, not decorative. Patterns. The same pattern repeated, then varied, then repeated again. They were writing something, or trying to. I tried to read it through vibration alone. The text was too small, too fine for me to parse clearly through the medium of my own cartilage. But the intention came through even without the words. Someone down there was trying to make contact. Someone had felt the change in the tremors and was reaching upward. The arm kept moving. Day 5, day 6. By day 7, I had it at roughly the right angle to serve as a barrier on the eastern approach. Not a wall. I wasn't a wall, but a presence. A rise in terrain that would require the approaching Titan to notice it and decide how to respond. The other Titan was 3 days away by my estimation, walking at a consistent pace, still showing no signs of having detected me. That was the part I couldn't predict. Would it feel me? Would it recognize what I was, another being of the same fundamental nature, before it reached my ribs? Or would it simply walk, the way you walk through a landscape? You have no reason to examine carefully and encounter my arm as an obstacle it hadn't expected. And if it encountered my arm as an unexpected obstacle, what would it do? I had no information about this other Titan, its intentions, its disposition, its history. For all I knew, it was peaceful. A wanderer, something that had been doing exactly what I'd been doing, lying still somewhere, existing quietly, watching centuries go by. For all I knew, it was nothing like me at all. On day 8, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. A king's messenger arrived at the eastern cliff. I could tell it was a messenger by the pace of the movement, the specific fast rhythm of someone carrying urgent information on a deadline. The messenger climbed to where the young priest was working and delivered whatever they had come to deliver, and then left at the same urgent pace. The young priest stopped carving for 2 hours after that, just stood there, very still, at the cliff face. Then they started carving again, faster this time. I learned later, much later from context and inference, what the king's message had contained. Born the 9th had issued an evacuation order for the eastern settlements. Not all of them. Not yet. Just the lowest districts, the ones most exposed to whatever was causing the tremors. Practical, cautious, reasonable. Approximately 40,000 people began moving westward along my body over the next 24 hours. I felt their movement as a slow migration of warmth. Families, carts, animals. The particular chaotic vibration of a large group of people moving together with a mix of urgency and reluctance, carrying what they could. Some of them would be leaving homes their families had occupied for generations. Homes carved into my ribs. Homes that had outlasted everything. I felt something about that migration that I don't have a precise word for. Not guilt, I hadn't caused this. Not responsibility exactly. Something adjacent to both. The awareness that my existence had consequences that rippled outward in every direction, through every decision every person near me ever made. Day 9. The other Titan was close enough now that I could feel the ground displacement from its steps, without focusing specifically. It was just present. A background fact. The rib settlements that hadn't evacuated were still occupied. 160,000 people who had decided to stay or hadn't received the order or had nowhere else to go. The young priest was still on the eastern cliff on day 9. Still carving, still completely present, still reaching toward whatever I was. Day 10. The other Titan crested the horizon. From its perspective, walked past what it probably registered as a ridge and saw my arm for the first time. It stopped. I felt the cessation of its footfalls the way you feel a sound. Stop in the middle of a room. Sudden and absolute and full of implication. It had noticed. Something in the new geography of the eastern approach had registered as not natural, as something requiring examination. I held my arm completely still. Stopped the slow movement I'd been maintaining. Became, as much as possible, indistinguishable from terrain. Whether it would work, Whether a Titan could pass as a landscape to another Titan, I had no idea. I had no information about how our perception worked. In my experience, I perceived the world through vibration and pressure and weight, through the accumulation of small signals into large understanding. Maybe the other Titan perceived differently. Maybe it had abilities I didn't. Maybe it could look at a mountain and immediately know whether the mountain was alive. The silence of its stopped footfalls stretched for a long time. Then it moved again, but differently, not walking. Something more deliberate, more careful. The vibration of its movement had changed character entirely. No longer walking, but something more deliberate and careful. It was approaching my arm, slowly, with a specific quality of motion that I associated with attention. The young priest on the eastern cliff had also gone completely still. I felt, in a way I couldn't entirely explain, that both of us, the priest and I, were holding our breath at the same moment, waiting for the same thing. The other Titan reached my arm. I felt the contact, the pressure of its hand or foot or whatever part of it was touching me, as a warmth. Not aggressive, not violent. The careful, testing pressure of something trying to understand what it was touching. It pressed, held the pressure. I could feel it trying to determine what I was. Stone? Living tissue? Something in between? And then, this is the part I still think about, years later, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand. It knocked. 3 times. Slow and deliberate and impossibly gentle for something its size. The equivalent of a person knocking on a door. I did not know what to do with that. I had spent 5 centuries learning to be still, learning to not react, learning patience as a survival skill. And something was knocking on my arm. I made a decision so fast it barely felt like a decision. 2 knocks back, simple, direct. Here I am, I'm here. The eastern settlements shook with the impact. In the Rib Cities, shelves fell, doors opened on their own. The temple bells rang without anyone touching them. The young priest, pressed against the cliff face, felt the vibration run through the stone and into their hands and up their arms and into their chest. I know this because they stopped moving entirely for a full minute. The kind of stillness that means the body has encountered something the mind doesn't have a category for yet. From the other Titan, a pause, long enough that I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake, if 2 knocks meant something different in whatever language enormous beings used to communicate. Then 3 knocks back. My original pattern returned to me. Hello, I said with my arm, or whatever the Titan scale gesture equivalent of hello was. Something that meant, I'm here, I'm aware, I'm not a mountain. Hello, it said with its answer. Something that meant, I hear you, I know what you are. I know, I'm not moving. This was the entirety of our first conversation. 6 knocks total, exchanged across the distance equivalent to a city block in Titan scale, geological small talk. But it was something. It was more than I had communicated with any living being in 500 years. What came next was slower and more complicated and honestly more terrifying than the original app Roach had been. Because now we had established that we were both here, both aware, both, presumably, capable of intention. Which meant the next question wasn't whether we would interact. It was what the interaction would be, and I still didn't know anything about this other Titan, its origins, its nature, whether it had people living on it the way the Verret lived on me, whether it was alone, whether it was angry, whether the direction it had been walking was destination or wandering. I had 2 knocks and 3 knocks in the gentleness of its initial contact. That was everything I knew. Over the next 3 days, we developed a language of sorts, limited, imprecise, but functional. Single knock, acknowledgement. I hear you, I'm still here. 2 knocks, presence. Something like I exist, or perhaps more accurately, I'm not what you think I am. 3 knocks, question? The upward inflection made out of seismic activity. Silence extended. Answer no. Or more accurately, I have no response that fits this framework. It was the most basic possible communication. Vocabulary of 4 words. But we used it constantly for 3 days, establishing facts. I knocked 3 times. Question? It knocked once. Acknowledgement? I knocked twice. Presence? It knocked twice back. Presence acknowledged. I knocked 3 times. Question? It knocked twice. Presence. Then once. Acknowledgement. Then 3 times. Question back. Which I interpreted, and this interpretation might have been wrong, I want to be clear about that, as I understand you're here. Why? Why are you here? Why are you lying in this place? Why have you been here? Why didn't you move when I approached? All of those simultaneously, or just the simplest one, or something else entirely that my framework wasn't equipped to parse. I knocked twice. Presence, then paused for what in human scale would have been about 30 seconds, and knocked twice more. Presence again. I'm here because this is where they are. The people, the Verret, the 500,000 lives I've spent 5 centuries accidentally becoming responsible for. Whether it understood that specific meaning, whether a double knock could carry the weight of 500,000 lives, I had no way to know. But it went still after my answer. A long, thinking stillness that I recognized because I had spent centuries doing exactly the same thing. The Verret, during all of this geological communication, were having a completely different experience of the exact same events. The rhythmic vibrations that had started with my arm's movement had become a constant background of their lives. The priests had been interpreting nonstop for 3 days. The dominant interpretation, which had spread through all 6 cities and achieved something close to consensus, was that the prophecy of Dorath was unfolding in real time. The god was stirring. The tremors were communication, divine speech translated into geological language. The faithful needed to prepare for the ascension. The evacuation of the eastern districts had been reinterpreted as sacred pilgrimage. The people moving westward weren't refugees. They were the advance wave of the ascension. This was, I should be clear, entirely incorrect as a description of what was happening. But I found it strangely moving anyway. There was something in the human determination to find meaning, to look at incomprehensible events and build a story that made them livable, that I respected deeply. The young priest on the eastern cliff had a different interpretation. I knew this because their carving had continued through all 3 days of not communication. They were writing something long, extended, a text that was clearly not liturgy or prayer, but something more personal, more exploratory. I couldn't read it. Still too fine, too small. But the rhythm of it was different from the formal temple writing I had learned to recognize over the centuries. More hesitant, more questioning. The rhythm of someone working something out as they wrote rather than transcribing something already known. On the 4th day after our first contact, the other Titan spoke again. Not knocks this time. Something entirely new and different. A sustained pressure. Not a blow, not a tap, but a slow pushing against my arm that lasted approximately 20 minutes and then released. I had no idea what it meant. I still don't with certainty. My best interpretation then and now was that it was asking me to move, to shift my arm out of its path. And I had to decide in real time whether to do that. The rib settlements were still mostly occupied. The evacuation had thinned them, 100,000 people instead of 200,000. But they were still there. The other Titan could walk around my arm. That was an option. My arm wasn't an impassable barrier. At Titan scale, it was more like a suggestion. But if it walked around my arm to the south, it would pass directly through the ankle settlements, the oldest part of the Verret civilization, the cities that had been there since the beginning. If it walked around to the north, it would have to cross the Deepwater Sea at the small of my back, which would drain it. Gone. Centuries of ecosystem and mythology, drained in an afternoon. There was no path through my geography that didn't cost something. I knocked 3 times. Question. Asking what I had no means to ask precisely. What do you want? Where are you going? Why are you here at all? And knocked 3 times back. Same question returned to me. We were at an impasse. 2 enormous beings kneeling at the edge of human comprehension, asking each other questions neither could fully answer. And below us, 500,000 people were writing prophecies and carving cliff faces and evacuating cities and trying, in every way they knew how, to make sense of it all. I felt the young priest stop carving at midday, stand up slowly, walk with deliberate steps to the very edge of the cliff, stand there for a long time, looking at my arm, looking at what they thought was a new ridge formation, a geological change, a divine restructuring of the sacred landscape, and then do something I had never felt a Verret do before, reach out and press both palms flat against the stone, against my skin, staying there, not praying in any formal sense, not carving, not writing, just present, hands on the stone, patient, like someone sitting with a person who is suffering and has no helpful words, just presence, just the warmth of being there. I felt it. Their 2 palms, each about the size of a dust mote relative to me, pressing against the surface of my arm. I felt it more than I felt the other Titan's sustained push, more than I felt the evacuation migration, more than I had felt anything in a long time. And I knocked. Once, softly. So softly that I wasn't sure it would register. The young priest's hands pressed harder, both of them, simultaneously, pressing into the stone as hard as human hands could press. They felt it. They felt my answer. I know this because they did not move for a long time after, just stayed there, palms flat against my arm, in the strange geography of an impossible moment. Then they went back to carving, faster, with a different quality now, not exploratory, but certain. I still don't know what they wrote. I've thought about it for a very long time. I have theories, but I know that whatever it was, it changed the young priest. The quality of their presence on that cliff face was different after. Less questioning, more decided. The other Titan tried the sustained pressure again on day 5. Longer this time. 40 minutes. The pressure of something that had patience but also purpose. I knocked twice. presence, then twice more. The people are here, I'm not moving. It stopped, held still for a long time. Then it did something that changed everything. It lay down. I felt it happen in the same way I would have felt an earthquake. The sudden massive redistribution of weight, the ground reacting to an enormous load being placed on it over a period of about an hour. It was lying down, in the field to my east, positioning itself parallel to me, separated by a distance of perhaps 20 Titan lengths. Settling, going still in the specific way I knew intimately, the way of something very large choosing to stop moving for a while. I did not know what this meant. I turned it over from every angle I could think of. Threat display? Probably not. Lying down was not a threatening posture. Exhaustion? Possible, but it had been walking steadily for a long time, not exerting itself. Exhaustion seemed unlikely as an explanation. Waiting? That felt closest. It felt like waiting. And then, slowly, with the patience of something that had existed long enough to be comfortable with ambiguity, I began to feel something else, something emanating from where it had lain down. Not vibration exactly, more like the quality of the silence around it, the silence of something inhabited. I pushed every sense I had outward toward the eastern field, trying to understand what I was detecting. It took 2 days to be certain. There were people on it too, living on the other Titan the way the Verret lived on me. Not the same kind of people. The signatures of their movement were different. Faster, lighter, more widely distributed across the surface than the Verret's concentrated city pattern. More nomadic, less permanent. People who had learned to live on something that moved. People who had built their entire existence around the assumption that the ground beneath them was alive and would move again. The other Titan had stopped walking because of its people too. It had stopped and lain down because movement endangered the ones living on it. We were the same. We had both spent an unknowable amount of time carrying lives we hadn't chosen, becoming responsible for people who didn't know what they were standing on. We were both stuck, not by physical limitation, by the same weight, the same impossible tenderness for small things that had grown on us without permission. I knocked once, slowly, just acknowledgement, just, I understand now. It knocked once back, same weight to it, same quiet. Hello again, it said with one knock. I see you now. I finally see what you are. I know, I said back. I see you too. This was not the end of our problems. It was, if anything, the beginning of them. Because the two groups of people living on us, the Verret on me, the unnamed civilization on the other Titan, had now been living in proximity for a week. They had seen each other, or rather they had seen the effects of each other, the lights of each other's cities in the dark, the smoke of each other's cooking fires. The Verret religious establishment had already declared the new presence to the east a sign, evidence of the divine drama unfolding. The question was, what kind of sign? That debate was currently consuming approximately half the priests in the Citadel. Boran the Ninth had called his generals together 3 times in the past week. I had felt the specific gravity of armed men assembling and assembling again. He was not a man who sat still in the face of uncertainty. That was both his best quality and his most dangerous one. And the people on the other Titan, I would learn their name later. They called themselves the Ashran. The Ashran were also watching. From their elevated position on a living landscape, they had seen the Verret cities. 6 of them, dense and permanent and ancient, spread across what they didn't know was my body. I couldn't know what they made of it. But they were organized people, mobile people, people who had spent generations reading the world from an unusual vantage point. They were not, I strongly suspected, the kind of people who simply ignored extraordinary things when they encountered them. The other Titan, I would also learn a name later, or something close to one. The Ashran called it by a sound I couldn't render precisely. It sent me a new signal on the 8th day. Not knocks. A pattern I hadn't encountered before. A sustained series of vibrations, irregular but clearly structured, like someone trying to explain something complicated in a language that only barely existed. I listened to it for hours, tried to parse it, tried to find the underlying grammar. What I eventually concluded, and I want to be clear this was interpretation, not translation, was that it was describing its history, the long walk, the distance it had covered, what had driven it westward, what it had left behind. The signal had a quality to it that I recognized from the inside because I had lived it too. Not grief, exactly. More like the specific exhaustion of something that has been carrying weight for so long, it has forgotten what it felt like to put it down. It had been walking for a long time. Before the Ashran, before whatever civilization had preceded them, it had been walking away from something. Not toward anything, away. And the walking had accumulated century by century into a distance so great that whatever it was walking away from should have been irrelevant by now. But it still carried the shape of the departure in its motion. You can hear that in things sometimes, the ghost of an old direction. I sent something back. My own signal, slower, rougher, less practiced, the shape of 500 years of lying still. What had been on the other end of that stillness, what I'd been lying next to all this time, the sense, which I'd never articulated even to myself, of having chosen a particular spot to stop and then slowly, imperceptibly, having chosen it more and more permanently as time went on. We talked like this for 3 days, badly, imprecisely, in a language we were inventing as we went, using the only medium we had, the earth itself, the pressure and vibration of two enormous bodies communicating through stone. By the end of it, I knew 2 things about the other Titan that I hadn't known before. First, it was not dangerous, not in the way I had feared. It had stopped because of the Asherin, yes, but also because it had felt me and understood, at some level below language, that this place was already occupied. Second, whatever it had been walking from was still there, behind it, to the east, far away by any normal scale, but not by Titan scale, untraceable. And it was coming, not chasing, precisely, but moving westward, the way the other Titan had been moving westward, with the slow inevitability of something that has a destination, something larger than either of us, something that had driven the other Titan from its resting place and would eventually drive it again from this one, if we let it. I held that information very still inside me, turning it over slowly, thinking about what it meant for everything I had been planning. The Verret had built their civilization on me because I was reliable, the most stable thing in their world, the eternal God-touched terrain that never failed. I had tried for 5 centuries to deserve that trust through stillness, through not moving, through being, as far as any of them could tell, permanent. Now I had learned that something was coming that made permanence impossible, that the question wasn't if things would change, but only when. And there was another question, the harder one. If something large enough to displace a Titan was moving westward, and it was still many years away at current speed, years by Titan measure, meaning decades, or centuries by human measure, what was the responsible thing to do with this knowledge? Tell the Verret? I had absolutely no way to tell them anything, not directly. Move them preemptively? Move them where? I was their world. I was the terrain. There was no safe direction I could point them that wouldn't be defined by me, or wait and hope that I was strong enough, when the time came, to hold whatever was coming, to be the wall between it and everything that lived on me. I turned that option over for a long time. The idea that I might be enough, that I might be strong enough, prepared enough, ancient enough to stand against something that had made another Titan flee. The arrogance of that thought wasn't lost on me, but neither was the alternative. On the 9th day after first contact, the young priest climbed back to the summit of the eastern cliff. They were carrying something. The weight distribution as they climbed was different. One shoulder heavier than the other, the adjustment of someone transporting something fragile. They reached the summit after a long climb, sat down on the stone, arranged the tablets, and began to read aloud. I know they were reading because the rhythm of their breath changed, the particular pattern of voice that happens when someone speaks words they have written rather than speaks words as they think of them. They were reading what they had spent 8 days writing, into the empty air, to no audience they could see, to the stone, to me. I could not hear words. I could feel the vibration of sound, the patterns of breath and voice, but not the content. The meaning was beyond me. What I could feel was the shape of it, long, structured, built carefully over 8 days of sustained attention, and directed at me with a precision of intention that I had never felt from a human before. Not prayer, which disperses upward into the general divine. This was specific, addressed. It took approximately 3 hours. At the end of it, they went quiet, stayed still for a long time. Then they placed the clay tablets. I felt the weight of them, the careful stacking, against the cliff face and left them there. Against my arm, against my actual skin, left for no reader I knew of, and left them there. I lay there in the quiet that followed and thought about that young priest for a long time, about what it means to spend 8 days writing something for an audience that can't read it, about what kind of faith that requires. Not the faith of Dorath's tradition, the faith that the god will eventually do something dramatic and visible and world-changing. A quieter faith, the faith that presence is enough, that being heard, even without confirmation of being heard, is worth the effort of speaking, that something somewhere is paying attention, even if it can never tell you directly. I knocked once, softly, after they were long gone, into the empty cliff, directed at the tablets already cold from the night air, just sending it into the stone regardless. Just acknowledgement, just, I heard you, I'm still here, I'm listening. The tablets were still there 3 days later when Born the Ninth's army arrived at the eastern cliff. Not a large army by historical standards, perhaps 3,000 soldiers, equipped for a rapid response situation, not a prolonged siege. Born the Ninth had decided that whatever was happening in the east was a threat, and that the appropriate response to threats was to meet them with force. I say this without judgment. From his perspective, from the perspective of a man responsible for 500,000 lives. Watching the ground shake and seeing strange new geography appear to the east and feeling his civilization vibrate with uncertainty. The decision to mobilize was rational. He didn't know he was sending an army to stand at the base of my arm and shout at the side of another living being. The army arrived at the eastern cliff, camped at the base, sent scouts up the new ridge, up my arm, to observe the eastern field. Those scouts came back with a report that I could feel had destabilized them. Not the terrain they had expected. Something strange. A landscape that was, the word they probably used was alive, because the Ashran from the scouts' elevated vantage point on my arm were visible. Not individual people. Too small, too far, but the signs of them, the lights, the patterns of organized activity on a landscape that was itself moving, breathing. The other Titan, lying still in the eastern field, was perceptibly not stone, not if you knew what to look for. The army camped. Boren sent messages back to the Citadel, awaited orders that would take days to arrive. And in that waiting, in that fragile pause before decision, something happened that changed the shape of everything. One of the scouts, returning from the summit of my arm with their report, discovered the clay tablets, the young priest's 8 days of writing, left against the stone, addressed to no one any soldier would have thought to address. The scout, to their credit, or perhaps out of pure curiosity, sat down and read them, all of them, every tablet in the cold light at the top of the eastern cliff. I know this because they stayed there for a very long time, much longer than the reading should have taken. They went back down the cliff eventually. I tracked their movement carefully, lighter than when they had come up, in the way people are sometimes lighter after reading something that explains something they had been carrying. I don't know what happened to those tablets after that, whether the scout kept them, whether they showed them to the generals, whether Boren the Ninth ever read them. What I know is what happened next, which is that the army, after 2 days of camping at the base of my arm, did not attack, didn't advance, didn't send further scouts, didn't do anything aggressive at all. They built fires and waited. And the waiting had a different quality from the aggressive, mobilized waiting they had arrived with, more patient, more thoughtful. Whatever the young priest had written in those 8 days on the cliff face, it had been enough to give an army pause. That is not nothing. That is, if anything, everything. The other Titan knocked once from the eastern field, single, soft, low. Acknowledgement. I knocked once back. I know, I feel it too. We lay in the dark on opposite sides of a cliff that was my own arm, carrying our people and our histories, listening to the army think, and for one moment, one specific, unrepeatable, deeply improbable, hard-earned moment, the entire world went very still. I had been waiting for that stillness. I had spent 500 years learning to be still, and 1 week learning that stillness was not enough, and now I was still again, but differently. Not the stillness of hiding, not the stillness of avoidance, the stillness of someone who has made a choice and is present in it. The army waited. The Ashran moved softly on the other Titan. The young priest was back in the Citadel, presumably, writing something new. And somewhere to the east, far away across distances that would take centuries for anything human to cross, something larger than both of us was moving westward through the world. I was not going to let it arrive without being ready. I was not going to let my people, my Verit, my cities, my 500,000 strangers who had become everything, face it unprepared. But being ready was a problem I had never had to solve before. Being ready required things I had spent 500 years specifically not doing. Moving, speaking, choosing sides, acting in the world rather than being acted upon. I had started with an arm, 3 degrees, 11 days of the most careful motion I had ever attempted. It was going to have to become more than that. The question was, how much more, and whether I could do it without destroying what I was trying to protect in the process. I knocked twice on the ground. Not to the other Titan, just into the earth beneath me, the equivalent of cracking my knuckles. Okay, I said to no one. Okay, let's begin. If this story is landing for you so far, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think is coming. Because even I was surprised by what happened next. The first thing I needed to understand, and this took longer than I expected, given that I had 5 centuries of experience being what I was, this was what being ready actually meant. In human terms, being ready for a threat means training, preparation, building walls, stocking supplies, learning to fight. I had walls. I was walls. 500,000 people had been living inside them for 500 years and calling them home. What I didn't have was anything resembling a plan, an intention, a sense of agency that went beyond reacting to what happened near me. I had spent 5 centuries in a posture of pure response. Something happened. I felt it. I chose stillness. That was the whole of my engagement with the world. The arm movement, 11 days of geological effort to shift something 3 degrees, had been the first proactive choice I'd made since lying down. Now I needed to make more of them, and I needed to do it without triggering the cascading disasters that any large motion of my body could cause. The other Titan seemed to understand this constraint. Its communications over the following days had a quality of patience to them, a waiting together quality. It had been living with the same constraint far longer than I had. Its people, the Ashran, had adapted their entire civilization to the movement of a living landscape. They had built nothing permanent. They carried everything. They had developed a relationship with the ground beneath them that was fundamentally different from the Verit's relationship with me. The Verit trusted me to be still. The Ashran trusted the other Titan to move. Both relationships required trust. One required stillness as the foundation of it. The other required the opposite. I thought about that difference for a long time, about what it said about the nature of trust, about what it cost and what it gave. On the 12th day after first contact, the Verit army at the base of my arm received its orders from Borin the Ninth. I had been waiting for those orders with something close to dread, not because I knew what they would be, I didn't, but because I understood what was at stake in them. Whatever Borin the Ninth decided, it would be made without knowing the actual nature of the situation, without knowing that the ridge his army was camped at was my arm, without knowing that the landscape to the east was another living being with people on it, and that those people had as much at stake as his own. He would decide based on what a king could see: strange new terrain, unknown civilization, uncertain threat, and the ancient duty to protect what was his. The orders arrived. I felt the moment of their delivery as a change in the movement patterns of the army, the specific reorganization of a force that has received new purpose. They were not advancing, they were building. The army had been ordered to construct a fortified position at the base of the eastern cliff. A permanent presence, an extended watch. Not an attack, not yet, but a statement of territorial claim. This is ours. We are here. We will remain. Borin the Ninth was, in his careful way, drawing a line. Not a sword, but a line. Still, it was something that could easily become a sword. The building began within hours. I felt the weight of the construction. Heavy, organized, deliberate, accumulating against the base of my arm. They were building on me. More of them were building on me. Not a city, not a temple, not a place of ordinary life. A fortification. An instrument of potential violence resting against my skin. I knocked 3 times toward the eastern field. Question: what do we do with this? The other Titan was quiet for a long time, then knocked once. Acknowledgement, then once more, then a 3rd time, which I read in the forward language we had built between us as, I see it. I'm thinking. I don't know yet either. Fair, honest, appropriate to the situation. 2 enormous beings staring at a military construction project happening on one of their limbs. The Ashran, I realized, were watching too. Their movement patterns on the Eastern Titan had changed over the past several days, more concentrated near the western edge where my arm was visible. They were observers. Their whole civilization had been built on observation, reading a living landscape, reading the world, reading signs, and making decisions from them. They were reading this the way they read everything, carefully, without obvious conclusion, but with evident attention. I wondered, not for the first time, what the Verit looked like from their perspective. The 6 cities, the temple lights, the organized grid of streets and markets, an enormous civilization built on something that clearly wasn't stone, from the perspective of people who had spent generations living on something that also wasn't stone. They would know, I thought. They would know what I was. They had always known what their own Titan was. They would recognize the signs. And if they knew, what did they make of the Verit? People who had lived on a living being for 5 centuries without knowing it? Did they pity them? Find them naive? Fear what would happen when the knowledge eventually arrived? The fortification at the base of my arm grew through the following week. Stone walls rising from the eastern cliff base, towers at intervals, a gate facing eastward. The army transformed from a mobile force into a garrison, a permanent presence on my body with a specific defensive orientation. Whatever signal Borin the Ninth had decided to send, this was a louder version of it. We are here. This terrain is ours. We have always been here. From a human perspective, it was reasonable geopolitics. From my perspective, it was an army building a castle on my wrist. I found, somewhere around day 15, that I was no longer capable of maintaining the passive detachment I had cultivated over 5 centuries. The stillness was still there. I hadn't moved again after the arm reposition, and I wasn't planning to without clear necessity, but the internal detachment was gone. The careful distance I had maintained between myself and the people living on me, the necessary buffer that had let me observe without aching, that was gone. The week of impossible communication with the other Titan, the young priest's hands on my arm, the army building walls on my wrist had dissolved it. I cared. Actively, uncomfortably, inconveniently cared about what happened to all of them. The Verit, the Ashran, the 2 kings who were currently staring at each other across a cliff face that was my own body. Caring was not, I was discovering, particularly useful as a strategy. It didn't clarify anything. It didn't resolve the fundamental problems. It just made everything more urgent and harder to think about clearly. But there it was. 5 centuries of careful observation had produced, at the end of it, the same thing that extended and careful observation of humans always and inevitably seemed to produce in me over centuries. Attachment. Helpless, inconvenient, absolute attachment. On the 16th day, an Ashran delegation crossed the eastern field and approached the base of my arm, approached the fortification. I felt their movement, lighter, faster, more fluid than Verret movement, coming westward across the open ground. A group of perhaps 12 people, moving with the particular confidence of people who were accustomed to reading terrain that moved beneath them. They reached the base of the fortification and stopped. I felt the precise weight of 12 people standing still at the gate. The Verret garrison had clearly seen them coming. I could feel the tension in the weight distribution of the armed men on the walls, the specific posture of people prepared for conflict. And then, nothing happened. They stood there, both groups, the garrison on the walls, the Ashran delegation at the gate, standing still, looking at each other across a distance that was, in physical terms, very small, and in every other term, enormous. Someone in the Ashran delegation made a gesture. I couldn't feel gestures. Too fine, too small. But I could feel the weight shift of it. One person stepping slightly forward, hands away from weapons, the universal signal that transcended language, culture, century. I'm not here to fight. The garrison held, tense, armed, uncertain. And then one soldier, not an officer, based on the weight of their armament, walked to the gate and opened it. Not an order. Not a decision from above. One soldier making a choice. The delegation entered. The gate remained open. I felt the mixing of movement patterns. Verret soldiers and Ashran visitors occupying the same space simultaneously for the first time. And it felt like something releasing. Not resolution. Nothing was resolved. Not safety. Nobody was safe yet. Just the first step, the smallest possible step, taken by ordinary people who had decided that the alternative wasn't worth it. I knocked once, into the ground, into nothing in particular. Just once. Acknowledgement. I see you. What you just did, that small thing, that open gate, I see it. The east knocked once back. The other Titan had felt the delegation's crossing, the approach, the open gate. It had also felt what I felt. It also knew what had happened and what it might mean. Once, it said, I know, I see it too. We lay there, 2 enormous beings in the dark, and let the smallest possible thing be enough for now. The young priest arrived at the fortification on the 17th day. I knew it was them by the pattern of their footsteps. Specific, familiar, unmistakable after years of attention. They had walked from the citadel. 3 days' journey for a Verret, through 6 cities, across the whole inhabited stretch of my lower body. They arrived tired. I could feel the tiredness in the weight of their footsteps. But they arrived, and then they did something unexpected. They walked calmly into the fortification, past the armed garrison, and asked directly and clearly to meet with the Ashran delegation. I know this because the weight patterns reorganized themselves. The Ashran group moving toward a common point, the young priest's single weight joining them. They were talking. I couldn't hear it. I never could hear words. But I could feel the weight of people sitting together, shifting toward each other, the specific vibration of extended communication. It lasted most of the day. The sun moved across my body. I had always been aware of the sun, the slow, warm transit of it, and the meeting continued below me. By the time the sun was gone and the night had settled, the patterns had changed again. The Ashran delegation had not left. The young priest had not returned toward the citadel. They were staying, together in the same space through the night. Not a treaty, not an alliance, just staying, just being in the same place without the world ending, which was, after 16 days of armies and prophecies and geological small talk, exactly what was needed. I settled my weight slowly into the ground beneath me. I settled my full weight slowly into the ground and let the centuries accumulate around me like familiar bedding. The darkness was quiet. The cities on my body were mostly still. The fortification below my arm glowed with small fires, 2 people sitting around them. The something coming from the east was still far away. Years away. Decades. Time enough to build something that might be ready for it. Or might not. Time enough to try. But that was tomorrow's problem. And the day after that. And all the days that followed, stretching out ahead of me into a future I couldn't see but was, for the first time in 5 centuries, facing directly. I am still here, I said to no one. To the dark, to the ground, to the 500,000 people sleeping on my body without knowing what I was. I'm still here. And I'm not going anywhere. The east knocked once, soft and low, sometime in the middle of the night. I know, it said. I know, so am I. And that was enough. for that night to sleep on. Or whatever it is that Titans do when the world goes quiet and the stars come out and there is nothing left to decide, exist peacefully until morning, when everything would have to begin all over again from wherever we had left it. Morning came the way mornings always came for me. Not as light exactly, but as warmth. The slow transit of the sun across my body, starting at my feet and moving north. I had been feeling that transit for 5 centuries. It was the most reliable thing in my world. More reliable than kings. More reliable than prophecies. More reliable, honestly, than anything the Verret had ever built on me. The sun came up, the sun moved, the sun went down. Everything else was variable. On the 18th day after first contact, I woke, if that's the right word for whatever I did between night and morning, to a different quality of movement on my body. Not the gradual resumption of city life. Not the familiar chorus of a civilization starting its day. Something more deliberate, more organized, more pointed. The army at the fortification was moving, not marching, not the organized forward motion of an advance. More lateral, more measured. The movement of people who had received new orders. It took me several hours of careful attention to understand what I was feeling. They were expanding the fortification, building outward rather than upward. Boron the Ninth had sent more troops. The garrison had doubled overnight. The construction project at my wrist had grown from a watchtower into something more serious. Not an attack position, a diplomatic position. There's a specific architecture to each, and the Verret were building the second kind, which is heavier and more permanent. They were planning to stay permanently, not for a military campaign, for a diplomatic negotiation on unfamiliar ground. Boron the Ninth, whatever else he was not stupid. He had received the reports. He had read the situation. He was preparing to talk rather than fight. I found that profoundly reassuring. The most reassuring thing a king had done in the 5 centuries I'd spent underneath them. The Ashran, on the other side of my arm, had also noticed the expansion. Their movement patterns shifted, a slight concentration toward the western edge of the other Titan, more of them gathering where they could observe my body, watching the construction, reading it the way they read everything, reading everything with the careful attention of people who had long ago learned that reading terrain correctly was survival. The young priest arrived at the fortification on the 19th day, not alone this time. They had brought 4 others, other temple scholars I could tell by the weight and rhythm of their movement. They were going to work with the Ashran delegation. That was what the young priest had decided, somewhere in the time between the summit vigil and now, had decided not to wait for the king's negotiators, not to work within the official apparatus, to simply go and start talking and see what happened. The audacity of that impressed me enormously. The specific courage required to take an action that your king might not endorse because you believe the action is right. I thought about what had given them that courage. The 8 days of writing, the tablets left against my arm, the single knock I had sent back in the dark. Whether that knock had been part of it, I couldn't know. But I allowed myself the thought that it might have been, that something had reached through the stone and given them something to lean on. The conversation between the scholars and the Ashran lasted 4 days. The Ashran delegation did not leave during that time. Neither did the scholars. I felt the weight of them occupying the same space for 4 days, hour by hour, and watched the pattern of it change. The movement becoming more relaxed, more interspersed. Less the weight pattern of 2 groups staying carefully apart in the same room, and more the weight pattern of people who have begun to stop noticing the distinction. On the 3rd day of the meeting, something happened that I genuinely hadn't anticipated. The Ashran brought someone entirely new, a smaller weight than the others, moving differently, with the specific quality of someone very old, or someone who had spent so much time on a moving landscape that stillness felt strange to them. An elder. The Ashran had sent their elder into the fortification specifically, which meant this moment mattered at the deepest level. I had felt elders before. The specific gravity of people who carry authority by virtue of having outlasted everything around them. This person had that quality in abundance. They moved through the fortification slowly and sat down among the mixed group, Verret scholars, Ashran delegation, and began what I could only describe as a sustained vibration. Not voice exactly. More like the pattern of extended speech, the full rhythm of someone telling a very long and important story. They told a story for 2 days. The Ashran elder told whatever they had come to tell, and the scholars in the delegation sat around them and received it. I could not hear the content. I never could. But the shape of it reached me through the stone, long and complex and full of the specific cadence of something being passed down. Not history as records. History as memory, the kind that lives in bodies and voices and the particular way people breathe when they're telling something true. On the 4th day, the young priest did something I had not been expecting. They climbed back up the eastern cliff, back to the summit, back to where the tablets were. They climbed with a different quality than before, not searching this time, not reaching toward something uncertain, climbing as if returning to a place they knew. They reached the summit, and they began to read aloud again, but this time for longer, and with new material, additions to what they had written before. I think they were telling me what the elder had said, repeating it upward, into the stone, into me, because they had decided that I should know. I still couldn't hear words, but the act of it meant something that didn't require words. The deliberate turn toward the stone, the voice directed upward. Someone was treating me as a party to the negotiation, as something that had a stake in what was being decided, as something that deserved to be informed. I knocked twice. Presence? As softly as I could, which was still enough to register as a mild tremor in the lower city districts. The temple seismographers would have felt it. The young priest kept reading, didn't stop, didn't react visibly. I couldn't feel visible reactions at that scale, but they kept going, which felt like acknowledgement. That was the moment I understood what the young priest had written in their 8 days of work, or at least what it was about, structurally. It was a theory of the ground, a theological and philosophical argument for what the sacred terrain actually was, what it meant that it could be felt, that it responded. Not the traditional doctrine, not Dorath's tradition, not the watching God interpretation. Something new, something built from observation rather than inherited from authority. The argument that the ground was not a gift from a god. The argument that the ground was the god, not metaphorically, literally. That the sacred terrain was a living thing that had been here before the Verret and would be hereafter. And that this was not a reason to fear. It was a reason to be careful. I sat with that interpretation for a long time. The young priest had gotten it exactly right. Every word of it, or so I imagined, filling in the content from the shape. Gotten it right without any information that I could have given them. Just from 5 centuries of living on me and paying enough attention to notice. This is what sustained observation produces eventually, if you're willing to follow where it leads. Not the conclusion you expected. The one the evidence actually supports. Boron IX himself arrived at the fortification on the 22nd day. In person, with a formal escort. He came with a formal escort. 40 soldiers, 3 advisors. The specific weight of a man who is accustomed to his arrival mattering and has organized it accordingly. He was tall. I could tell from the relative weight distribution of his steps, the height of his center of gravity. Young for a king still, 40, perhaps 45. He surveyed the fortification, the construction, the expanded garrison. Then he went inside, where the scholars and the Ashran delegation were still encamped. I don't know what happened in that room. I felt the configuration of weights, the king, the scholars, the Ashran, the elder, assembling in one space. And then I felt them stay there, for a long time. Much longer than a formal diplomatic exchange would require. Whatever was being said, it was not the kind of conversation you had and then ended cleanly and walked out of. It was the kind you kept returning to the table for. It lasted 3 days. Boron IX slept in the fortification, which told me more than any detail of the conversation could have. He had come to talk, and he was staying until the talking was finished. On the 2nd day of the king's visit, while the negotiation was ongoing, the other Titan did something entirely new. It moved. Not much, nothing like the scale of my own arm reposition. A subtle shift, a change in shoulder angle which moved the Ashran villages several degrees north. From the Verret fortification, that shift would have been visible as the eastern landscape quietly reorganizing itself. The effect from the Verret fortification would have been visible. The eastern landscape shifting, the geography reorganizing itself in a way that no terrain does unless something very large is doing it deliberately. Boron IX would have felt it in the floor of the fortification. Every soldier in the garrison would have felt it. Every person in every city on my body would have felt it. The Titan was speaking, directly, to everyone, using the only language large enough for everyone to understand simultaneously. I recognized what it was doing because I had spent 11 days doing the same thing, more slowly and more carefully. It was demonstrating intent. I am not stone. I am here. I am making choices. The Verret in the fortification, the soldiers, the scholars, the king, went completely still. The specific stillness of people whose framework for reality has just been directly contradicted by observable fact. Whatever the young priest had been arguing for 4 days in that room, it had just been proven. The eastern landscape was alive. It had moved deliberately, gently, unmistakably on purpose. Boron IX stayed in his room for 6 hours after the shift. I know because his weight didn't move. Just stayed in one place still for 6 hours. I imagined what that was like. Being a king, a man whose entire life was built on the assumption that his authority derived from his relationship to a specific sacred terrain, and discovering that the terrain was a living person, something incomprehensibly larger than any person, that had existed before his family and would exist long after everything he built was gone. What does that do to a man? What does it do to a king? What do you do with the understanding that the thing you thought you ruled was, in fact, enduring you? He came out of his room on the evening of the 2nd day. I felt his weight resume movement. Deliberate, considered, not panicked, not the movement of someone who had broken, the movement of someone who had genuinely reoriented himself and found a new center of gravity for everything he had ever known. He went back to the negotiating room. I felt the configuration of weights resume, and it felt different now. The specific weight pattern of a conversation that has been restarted at a different level. Something had changed in those 6 hours. Boren the Ninth had gone in as a king negotiating with a foreign people over a border dispute. He came out as something else. I didn't have a word for what he came out as. But the shape of his movement after was the shape of someone who had accepted a much larger context. The Asherin Elder, I noticed, had been very still during those 6 hours too, waiting, patient in the way of people who have known this moment was coming and simply needed to let it arrive. On the third day, the negotiation ended, not with a treaty. The Verit didn't have the legal architecture for what would have been required, not with a declaration, with a gesture. The king and the Asherin Elder walked out of the fortification together, stood at the base of the eastern cliff, my arm, side by side. Stood there for a long time, not speaking, as far as I could tell, just standing in the same place, looking at the same thing. Then the elder placed one hand against the cliff face, against my arm, the same gesture the young priest had made weeks earlier. And then, slowly, with the gravity of a man who had just had everything reframed and was choosing how to respond, Boren the Ninth did the same. Both of them, simultaneously, palms flat against the stone, against me, holding exactly the same posture without having planned it. I knocked once, incredibly slowly, taking the better part of an hour to complete the single motion, keeping the seismic effect to its absolute minimum. It registered, far away in the lower cities, as a very small tremor. The seismographers would have noted it. The priests would have interpreted it. Here, at the base of my arm, two people felt it run through their palms and looked at each other. Not surprised, not anymore, prepared. They understood, both of them, what they were touching, what it meant that it had responded. The king removed his hand first, stood there for another long moment, then turned and walked back into the fortification. The elder kept their hand on the stone for longer, long after the king had gone, staying there in the late afternoon, alone at the cliff base. I understood that too. The elder had known before Boren had known, had lived their whole life on a living thing, had grown up understanding that the ground beneath them was a being. This was the same, different in every detail, but the same in the fundamental nature of it. You are standing on something that is aware of you. The elder finally dropped their hand, walked slowly back, stopped once, halfway to the fortification, and looked back at the cliff face. I didn't knock again. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said with one palm and one return knock. The conversation was complete. It was enough. More than enough, for what it was. The delegations left the fortification the next day. The Asherin Elder and the delegation returned eastward across the field. The young priest and the scholars returned westward toward the citadel. Boren the Ninth stayed one more day, then he too left. The garrison remained. The fortification was not being abandoned, but its purpose had shifted. Not a military presence, a meeting point, a permanent structure at the place where two civilizations had first looked at each other across the proof that the world was larger than either of them had imagined. I felt the departures as a lightning, not a loss. The people were still on me, still going about their lives in the 6 cities and 14 towns and hundreds of villages. But the specific concentrated weight of that negotiation, the thing I had been holding my breath through for 3 weeks, had lifted. And now I could think, really think, about what came next. The something from the east was still there, still moving. I had not forgotten it for a single moment of the negotiations. Every day that passed was a day closer, and I had spent the negotiations learning something that now felt urgently important. The Verit could be told, not everything, not the full scope of what was coming, which I wasn't certain of myself, but something. Enough. The young priest had proven that. Whatever they had written in those 8 days, it had reached Boren the Ninth, had moved him from a position to an understanding. If words on clay tablets could move a king, words spoken in person, with the full authority of someone who had been living on a living landscape their whole life, could move a civilization. The Asherin Elder had that authority. The young priest was developing it, and together with whatever they had built in those 4 days in the fortification, they had the beginning of something that could carry the message forward. But there was a problem, a significant one that I had been circling around and hadn't fully faced. I still didn't know what the thing from the east actually was. That specific gap in my knowledge was the central problem I hadn't yet solved. The other Titan had communicated its approach to me through our knock language and the sustained vibration signals, but the detail had been limited. The impression of something coming. The knowledge that it was large, not what it was, not what it wanted, not whether it could be reasoned with or would simply move through everything in its path, the way a storm moves through everything in its path. There was only one way to get more information, and it required doing something I had been specifically avoiding for 22 days. It required communicating more clearly with the other Titan than I had so far managed. Not knock language, something more substantial. I had been thinking about this problem since our first real exchange of signals, about whether there was a way to transmit more complex information through the medium of seismic activity. Not words, that was too fine, too detailed, but structure, pattern. The difference between a paragraph and a sentence isn't the letters, it's the organization. What if I didn't try to say specific things, but instead tried to create a structure that the other Titan could respond to? A framework, a question architecture. I had 6 categories of motion available to me at the scale of careful control. Left arm, right arm, upper body tilt, lower body tilt, and the subtle pressure I could vary at specific points. 6 categories was enough for a working vocabulary. Not English, not any language that had ever been spoken, but a language. I spent 2 days planning it out, mapping each motion type to a conceptual category, deciding which concepts were most essential, testing the plan against every failure mode I could think of. And then, on the 25th day after first contact, I started. It took 12 hours to transmit the first complete thought, using all 6 motion types in varying intensities and durations to build something that I hoped would be recognizable as structured communication rather than natural geological activity. The thought I tried to transmit was, there is something large coming from the east. What do you know about it? Whether it arrived intact, whether the other Titan understood the structure as structure, the question as question, I couldn't know until it responded. It was quiet for 18 hours after I finished, long enough that I began to wonder if I had made an error, if the signal had been too subtle or too complex, or simply had not carried. And then it responded. Also complex, also structured. Using a different vocabulary than mine, it had developed its own framework independently, which created translation problems. But the shape of it was clear enough. It was long and organized and clearly built to carry specific content. The other Titan was not just knocking back. It was trying to tell me something. It took me 3 days to work out the meaning. 3 days of returning to the signal again and again, trying different interpretive frameworks, checking my conclusions against the overall structure. What I eventually extracted, and I want to be clear that this was interpretation across a significant communication barrier, was something like this. It had been walking for approximately 2,000 years. Before that, it had been lying still as I had been. Something had woken it. Not the thing coming from the east. Something else. An earlier warning. A signal from beyond the eastern horizon that it had felt as wrong in the way certain sounds are wrong. Not loud, just wrong. It had started walking, carrying the ashran, trying to put distance between itself and whatever was coming. The walking had become its way of life. The ashran had adapted. 2,000 years of movement. The thing from the east was what it had been running from. And it had not outrun it. The distance had remained roughly constant over 2 millennia. The thing was not faster than a walking Titan, but it was persistent. It had never stopped. In 2,000 years, it had never stopped moving toward them. I held that information inside me for a long time, turned it over carefully. 2,000 years. The Ashran civilization had been built entirely on the move, structured entirely around the fact of fleeing for 2,000 years. And it had not been enough to outrun it. Here they were, in my territory. And the thing from the east was still coming. There was a word in the knock language we had developed, or close enough to a word. I used the complex motion pattern to ask the single most important question I had. Has anyone ever stopped it? The 18-hour silence again. Then the response, shorter this time, simple enough that I understood it immediately. No. I lay there holding that answer, holding the specific weight of it, the 2,000-year accumulated weight of no answer except no. I looked inward in the way I had learned to look inward over 5 centuries, at what I actually was, at what I was made of. I was old. I had been here before the Varet, before the Ashran, before the other Titan had started walking. I did not know how long I had been here exactly. The counting of time had become deliberately approximate beyond a certain very distant and uncountable point in my deep past. But I was old, and I was large, and I had spent 5 centuries becoming intimately familiar with every aspect of my own existence. The strength of my body, the depth of my roots. The thing from the east had never been stopped. That was a fact. But it had also never encountered something that had been lying still for 5 centuries, deliberately accumulating presence, becoming more deeply and specifically rooted in this precise piece of earth with every single year that accumulated. There was a difference between running from something and standing to meet it. I had not known, when I first lay down, that I was preparing for anything. I had simply lain down because moving was catastrophic. But the preparation had happened anyway. 5 centuries of stillness had made me something that running did not produce, something anchored, something that knew this specific piece of the earth better than anything else could know it. I didn't know if it was enough. I want to be honest about that. I didn't know. I still don't know with certainty. But I knew what I had, and I knew what the alternative was. And I knocked twice into the eastern field with the weight of everything I had spent 5 centuries becoming. I'm staying, I transmitted using every motion category I had. When it arrives, I will be here. This is my ground, and I'm not leaving. The other Titan was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I began to wonder if I had said something wrong, communicated something incorrectly through the imperfect language between us. Then it knocked back, long and complex, using the full vocabulary we had developed. A whole statement, not just acknowledgement. I worked through this signal carefully and repeatedly. It took hours to parse. Here's what it communicated as best I could translate. I have been running for 2,000 years because I thought staying would kill the ones on me. I thought movement was protection. I thought putting distance between them and the threat was the only thing a Titan could do for the people it carried. You have been still for 500 years, and your people are alive, and they have built something. I had forgotten that stillness was an option. I had been running so long I couldn't remember what it felt like to stop. I want to stop. I'm so tired of running, but if I stop, the Ashran... And then it paused, in the middle of the statement, and held the pause for a long time. I knocked twice. Presence, then once more. They'll be okay. I'm here. Whether I could promise that, whether I had any right to promise that, was a question I was actively not answering. But I knocked it anyway. Because it was true in the only way I could make it true. I was here. I was staying. I had chosen this ground. That was the only promise I could make, and I made it completely. The other Titan shifted again. A longer, slower movement than the shoulder tilt 2 days ago. The full settling of an enormous body choosing a new position. It was lying down. Completely. Fully. Alongside me in the eastern field, with the deliberateness of something that had been standing for 2,000 years and was finally sitting down. The Ashran would feel it. Their entire mobile civilization would feel their ground changing from moving to still for the first time in 2,000 years. I imagined what that was like. The ground you had only ever known as movement suddenly going still, the thing you had built your entire culture around. The constant motion, the constant adaptation, the constant reading of a landscape in perpetual motion, the whole architecture of their existence, suddenly and completely stopping. The Ashran were going to need time to understand what had happened, were going to need to restructure everything they knew about their existence, and they were going to do it next to the Verret, a civilization that had built everything on the assumption of permanent stillness, who were themselves restructuring everything they knew about their sacred ground. 2 civilizations, side by side, both discovering simultaneously that the world was both more and less than they had thought. I could not fix that for them, could not smooth it, could only be what I was, present still as reliable as I could be, and let them work it out. The young priest returned to the citadel and wrote for 7 days straight. I know because the distinctive vibration of their work was almost constant for that entire period. Born the 9th called 3 councils in the days after returning from the fortification. The weight patterns of large gatherings in the citadel hall, one after another, each slightly different in composition. The military generals first, then the senior priests. Then, this one was unusual, I felt it as a departure from established pattern. A mixed group, soldiers and temple scholars together. He was building something, a structure for responding to what he had learned. Not a perfect structure. Nothing built this quickly in the face of this much upheaval could be perfect, but something functional. Something that could hold the weight of a civilization that had just discovered it was living on a person. The Ashran began settling on the 28th day. Not all of them. Some portion maintained their mobile habits because 2,000 years of culture doesn't change in a week. But a significant portion began what I could only describe as setting up. The specific vibration pattern of people who were no longer preparing to move and were instead preparing to stay. They had their own young priest, I eventually realized. Not a priest exactly, but someone with the same quality of deliberate attention. I identified them by the same method, a distinctive, individual vibration pattern that I began to recognize among all the others. This person moved along the Eastern Titan's body with a specific rhythm, systematic, comprehensive, the movement of someone mapping, learning the geography of a landscape that had been in constant motion and was now, for the first time, still, the way I had learned my own geography over 5 centuries. The Ashran mapper was trying to do in weeks what I had done over decades. I could not help them directly. But I knocked twice toward the eastern field, specifically timed to coincide with a moment when the mapper was in the area facing my direction. Not a conversation, just acknowledgement. You're doing the right thing. Keep going. Whether it reached them, whether a gentle seismic signal could be targeted enough to reach one person, I doubted, but I tried. On the 32nd day, The young priest returned to the cliff summit one more time. I recognized the footsteps before they had even reached the halfway point. They climbed to the top and stood there in the early morning. The sun was still low. I could feel the cold of early light in the slight contraction of stone. They brought no tablets on this visit, did not begin to read or write, just stood at the summit in silence for a long time. Then they sat down, cross-legged, I think, from the weight distribution, facing east, looking out at the other Titan lying in the field, looking out at the Asheron settlements that were visibly beginning to shift from temporary camps toward something permanent, looking at the changed world, the world that was different from the one they had been born into, and that was not going to change back. I knocked once, very softly, just presence, just, I'm here. They stayed for 3 hours, then climbed back down. It was enough, I thought, watching them go. Not everything. This was not a story that was anywhere near its ending. The thing from the east was still coming. There were still armies and profound misunderstandings and centuries of difficult negotiation stretching ahead of everyone. The Verret still didn't collectively know what they were living on. The Asheron still didn't fully know what lying still meant for everything they had built. 2 civilizations and 2 Titans had taken 3 steps toward each other, and every one of those 3 steps had cost something, and there were 1,000 more steps ahead. But 3 steps were 3 more steps than there had been a month ago, and the young priest was climbing back down the cliff with the specific quality of movement that meant they would come back. And the other Titan was lying still for the first time in 2,000 years, and Born the Ninth had placed his palm against my arm. And somewhere in the fortification at my wrist, the small fires were still burning. 2 people sitting around them, learning what it felt like to stay in the same place. The thing from the east was still coming, still moving westward. I was not going to pretend otherwise to myself or anyone. But it was going to arrive, when it arrived, to something different from what it had been pursuing for 2 millennia. Not a running civilization and a Titan in flight. It was going to arrive to 2 Titans lying still side by side. To 2 civilizations that were, haltingly and imperfectly and with enormous difficulty, building something together on the ground between them. It was going to arrive at something deeply rooted. Something that had chosen this ground with full deliberation and intended absolutely to keep it. Whether that was enough, whether 2 Titans and 2 civilizations, and a young priest with 8 days of tablets, and a king who had learned to place his palm against stone were enough. I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know. And I had been a geological feature long enough to be comfortable with not knowing. What I knew was this. I had been lying still for 500 years because moving caused catastrophe. I had been lying still out of careful, deliberate avoidance. Now I was lying still because I had chosen this ground. Because the people on me had become, without asking, the most important thing in my existence. Because the other Titan needed something stable to lie next to. Something that wasn't also running, something already decided. Because sometimes the bravest thing available is not movement, is not action, is the deliberate, committed, eyes-open choice to stay exactly where you are and let the world bring its problems to you. I was a Titan. I had the patience of geological time. I had roots deeper than any civilization on my surface could measure. If something was coming, let it come. I would be here. I was staying. I knocked twice into the ground, soft and final and certain. Twice. Presence. I am here. This is my ground. Leave a comment below. Do you think staying was the right call? Because where things went from here is something I didn't expect. Even I didn't see part 4 coming. There were things I had not communicated to the other Titan. Not because I was hiding them, because I didn't know how to fit them into a language built from seismic patterns and 4 categories of motion. The people living on me. Specifically how many of them there were. Specifically the fact that they had no idea what they were living on. The Asheron knew. They had always known. Their whole civilization was built on the knowledge. The relationship between an Asheron and the Titan they lived on was one of mutual, explicit awareness. They felt the Titan move and understood what movement meant. They adapted in real time. They had songs about it, stories. Their theology was not the Verret's theology of the God who sleeps. It was the theology of the God who carries, the God who is in motion and takes you with it. The Verret had a theology that was structurally the opposite, the God who holds, the God who is foundation, the God who does not move so that you can build. Both theologies had found something real. Both of them had found a genuine aspect of what we were. The holding and the carrying were both true. They just described different Titans. But neither theology had ever had to face the question of what happened when the God chose, when the foundation decided to act, when the carrier decided to stop. Because in both traditions, the Titan was fixed, either permanently still or permanently moving, an eternal condition, a fact of the world. Neither tradition had accommodated the idea of a Titan that had been still and might choose to move, or a Titan that had been moving and had chosen to stop. A Titan that made decisions. The young priest's text, the 8 days of work that I had felt but not read, had apparently been an attempt to accommodate exactly that. An argument that the god's will was not expressed through geology but through choice. That the tremors were not natural events happening to a passive divine landscape, but rather deliberate and intentional communications from a very large being that had actual preferences and the means to express them. It was a revolution in Verret theology. It was the kind of argument that gets people who make it in trouble, and then gets them vindicated a century later when everyone acts as if they always believed it. I thought about the young priest a lot in the weeks after the negotiations, about what it had cost them to make that argument to an institution that had 5 centuries of doctrine pointing in the opposite dire. Tiction. I thought about how they had climbed the cliff without a path, how they had stayed on the summit for hours, alone with the stone and the wind, how they had written for 8 full days on that cliff face without any confirmation that anyone was there to read it. The courage of that, the specific, sustained, low-drama courage of just continuing to pay attention when the easier thing would be to accept the inherited explanation, was a quality I had genuinely not encountered in any individual human during 5 centuries of sustained and careful observation. Not because courage was rare. The Verret had shown enormous courage throughout their history. Military courage, survival courage, the courage of rebuilding after the plague. But this was a different kind. The courage to change the framework. The courage to say, the thing I was given to explain the world does not explain this world, and I am going to start over. Most people never do that. Most institutions never do that. They extend the old framework, bend it, strain it to accommodate the new evidence rather than building a new framework that actually fits. The young priest was building a new framework, alone at first, and then not alone. The Asherin elder had recognized what they were doing immediately, I thought, had come to the fortification specifically to help build it. 2 traditions, neither of which had ever encountered a titan that made choices, trying to build a theology of exactly that. Together. It would take generations. It would be contested and revised and partially wrong and periodically right, and the young priest would probably not live to see it completed. But they had started it. In 8 days of writing on a cliff face addressed to stone. That was how it began. I kept thinking about that, about the way things begin. The other titan had been running for 2,000 years. That had also begun with one decision. One moment of feeling something coming and choosing movement rather than stillness. My 5 centuries of stillness had also begun with one decision. One moment of feeling that motion was catastrophic and choosing to stop. The fortification had begun with a soldier opening a gate. One soldier, not an officer, making a call that wasn't theirs to make. The king placing his palm against the stone. One gesture, one moment, probably preceded by 6 hours of sitting still in a room trying to find the framework that could hold everything he now knew. Every large thing begins from one small thing. That is not a comforting thought. It's a frightening one. It means that the small things matter, every single one of them. And you can't always know in advance which small thing is the one that changes everything. I had knocked once in the dark, and it might have given a young priest the courage to climb a cliff without a path. One knock. Barely enough to register as anything at all, into an empty cliff face, in the middle of the night, after the person it might have been meant for was long gone. I thought about that a lot. The other titan, lying still in the eastern field, sent me a signal on the 35th day, using our developed vocabulary, structured and deliberate. Not a question this time. Not information about the approaching threat. A different category of communication entirely. It took me a long time to parse it, longer than usual, because the content was not tactical or historical or geographical. It was, as best as I could translate, personal. It was telling me what the Asherin called it, the name they used, the sound they made when they referred to the ground beneath them. I cannot reproduce the sound. It existed in a register I couldn't hear, in a language I didn't have. But I understood the shape of the communication, the deliberate offering of a name as an act of trust. This is what I am called. You should know what I am called. I had not been called anything by the Verret. I was the sacred terrain, the eternal ground, the God-touched landscape. No name, because names were for things that were separate from you, and the Verret did not experience themselves as separate from me. The Asherin had a name for their titan, because they experienced it as distinct from themselves, as a being they lived with, rather than a being they lived in. I held the shape of the offered name inside me and thought about what to offer back, whether I had anything to offer. I did not have a name. I had never needed one in 5 centuries of silence. But I had something. I had the quality of this particular piece of the world, the specific character of this ground, this geography, this 500-year accumulation of particular existence. I sent it back. Not a name. I didn't have the apparatus for names, but the fullest version of the self-expression I was capable of. The complex motion signal using all 6 categories, structured as a description. What I am, where I have been, what I have held, what I intend. It took the better part of a day to transmit. The other Titan received it in silence and was quiet for a long time. Then it knocked once, clear and warm and definite, the way a knock lands when someone has understood something and wants you to know they've understood it. "I know you now," it said with that single knock. "I hear what you are. I understand what you have been doing here." That was the beginning of a different kind of relationship between us. Not strategic alliance, though it was also that. Not just communication, though it was also that. Something older, something that didn't have a human word because humans didn't have the scale to develop the word for it. Two very old things lying side by side in the dark, having learned each other's names. I returned my attention to the Verret after that, to the day-by-day pulse of their civilization, which had been changing in ways I could feel but not fully map. The councils Boran the Ninth had been holding had produced something. The specific quality of organized Verret movement had shifted. More purposeful, more directed. They were building, not just the fortification. Across my body, new construction was beginning that had a different character from the ordinary expansion I had watched for 5 centuries. Wider roads between cities, following channels that had never been developed before. Storage facilities in locations that I recognized as geologically stable. The parts of me that moved least, specifically in areas where my tremors and movements would have the minimum possible structural effect on anything they built. They were preparing. Not for battle, not with the frantic urgency of military mobilization, with the patient deliberateness of people who had been told that something was coming and that they had time and show. LD use it well. Boran the Ninth was a better king than I had given him credit for. He had taken what he had learned at the fortification, the incomplete, inadequate, necessary truth of it, and had already begun translating it into workable policy well before his court had fully caught up with the new reality. A good king doesn't wait for consensus. A good king moves when movement is called for, and stays when staying is called for, and understands the difference. He had chosen to stay in his ground, as I had chosen to stay in mine. He was building carefully and deliberately with the time available. The young priest, I discovered, had been given a position. Not a traditional temple role. The weight patterns of their movement had changed in a way that suggested institutional authority, but structured differently than the traditional priestly hierarchy allowed. Something newly invented for a new situation. An advisor to the king? Something new. Something the Verret had apparently decided to create for this specific person because there was no existing category that fit. I thought that was the exactly correct response to unprecedented circumstances. Sometimes the right thing is to build an entirely new category. The Ashran were also building. More slowly, their culture had never built permanent structures, and they were learning as they went. But I could feel the beginnings of it. First buildings at the western edge of the other Titan's territory, tentative and careful, as if they were still half expecting the ground to start moving again. The ground stayed still, a fact that must have felt extraordinary to every Ashran alive. Day by day, their construction became slightly less tentative. The contact between the two peoples was increasing. I could feel it in the movement patterns. Ashran individuals spending time on the Verret side of the fortification, Verret individuals spending time in the Ashran territory. Not integration, not yet, not for a long time, but exchange. The specific movement pattern of people who had become curious about each other, learning. That was what I was feeling. Two civilizations beginning to learn each other, badly, haltingly, with frequent misunderstandings that I could feel as disruptions in the otherwise increasing patterns of contact between them. But they kept trying continuously. The disruptions never stopped the trying, which was everything. On the 40th day, the young priest climbed the eastern cliff one last time. I recognized their footsteps before they had left the city. They climbed steadily, without hesitation, reached the summit in the early morning. The sun was just clearing the distant horizon. They had brought something this time, a new weight, more substantial than tablets, something that clinked faintly against the stone as they settled into position. They sat for a while in silence. Then I felt the distinctive vibration of writing, new tablets, new text, being composed, not transcribed. They wrote for several hours, then stopped. Then I felt them carefully, precisely pressing the new tablets against the stone of the cliff face, alongside where the old ones had been, adding to them, building the argument further based on everything that had happened since the first set was written. The theology was growing, being updated by evidence, being revised by reality. I knocked once, slowly, while they were still at the summit. Not startling, gentle enough to be at the very edge of perceptible. They pressed their hand flat against the stone and held it there, both palms, patient and deliberate and entirely certain. I felt their palm, the warmth of it, the particular weight of one person on the summit of my arm, in the early morning with the sun coming up over the eastern field where another Titan lay still. And I held it. I held that contact as carefully as I had held everything for 500 years. More carefully, maybe. With more intention. The young priest stayed for a long time after writing. Longer than any of the previous visits. And when they finally climbed back down, they left more than tablets. They had brought something else. I felt it after they were gone. A weight pressed against the cliff, small and warm in the fading day. Not stone, not clay, something living. A plant, I thought, from the specific quality of its small warmth. Planted in a crack in the cliff face, right at the summit, the highest point any Verret had ever reached. Something small and alive growing in the stone, in me. Planted there by the person who had spent weeks insisting to an unreading cliff that the stone was real and aware and worth addressing. I held very still around it, adjusted the subtle pressures of my body so that the crack would not widen or shift. Made myself, as far as I could, the most stable substrate possible for a small plant to grow in. I was going to keep it alive, if I could. For as long as whatever was coming gave me the time to keep things alive. For as long as I was here. And I intended to be here for a very long time. The plant survived winter. That was the first thing. The first concrete proof that something I intended could hold against time and weather and the indifference of the world. It was a small thing, a low-growing variety that the Verret cultivated in their higher garden terraces, tough and slow and not particularly beautiful. But it had roots in my stone now. Real roots, finding the cracks between my deeper layers, drawing from me whatever it is that plants draw from stone. And I held still around it. Every small adjustment I made, every subtle pressure modulation that managed the geological stability of my arm, all of it now incorporated the presence of those roots. I was farming, in the most technical sense, deliberately modifying the conditions of my body to support one small living thing. If I had told myself that 5 centuries ago, lying down for the first time in the silence, that I would spend my existence carefully farming one cliff face plant, I would have found it either very funny or very sad, depending on the day. Now it just felt like what was true. What my existence had become, the largest thing in the region, making itself the best possible home for something impossibly small. There's a specific kind of satisfaction in that reversal. I didn't have a precise word for it, but it was unmistakably there. The winter passed. Spring arrived as it always arrived for me, as warmth, as the weight of snowmelt running down my surfaces in channels I had mapped over centuries. The Verret cities were busy in spring, always had been. The planting season, the repair of winter damage, the reopening of the mountain passes. This spring was different, busier, more coordinated. Born the Ninth's preparations had been running through the winter, quietly and continuously. The roads between the 6 cities had been widened. The storage facilities were being stocked, not just with food, but with building materials, tools, supplies for extended use. The citadel on my kneecap had been reinforced, not with weapons exactly, with capacity, the ability to hold more people than it had been built for. Born the Ninth was preparing for a population movement, not immediately. The timing wasn't urgent, the thing from the east was still years away by any estimation, but he was building the infrastructure for it, for the possibility that at some point the people living in the most exposed positions on my body would need to move to safer ones. He had been told enough. Not everything. No one had been told everything because I couldn't tell them anything directly, and the young priest's theology was still working through the institutional channels of the Verret religious structure and working through the channels of institutional authority. But enough. Enough for a king to act on. The young priest had done what I had thought impossible. They had moved an institution, slowly, with enormous effort, against significant resistance. The senior temple priests had not accepted the new framework easily. There had been months of formal disputation that I had felt as extended gatherings in the citadel, large groups of people in sustained argument, the specific vibration of people who care deeply about who is right. The traditional doctrine had pushed back hard. Doreth's tradition was 400 years old and deeply embedded. The idea of the god as a sleeping divine presence waiting to rise and carry the faithful to heaven was not a casual belief. It was a comfort, a covenant, a promise that had structured the way the Verret understood their place in the world and the meaning of their existence. The young priest was not just proposing a theological revision, they were asking people to give up something that had sustained them and replace it with something far less comfortable. The new framework didn't promise ascension. It didn't promise to be carried. It said, the ground is alive. The ground is aware. The ground has been watching you for 500 years and has chosen, so far, to hold everything you have built on it. That was not a covenant. That was a relationship. And relationships are harder than covenants. They require ongoing attention. They can change. They can be strained. A covenant says, the God will do this because he said he would. A relationship says, the God is here, and you have obligations to each other, and neither of you knows exactly how this ends. I thought the young priest's version was truer. I would obviously think that. But I also thought it was harder, and I respected the people who accepted it anyway. It took most of the winter, but by spring, a significant faction within the Verret temple structure had formally adopted the new framework. Not the majority, not yet. Probably not for a generation, but enough that it was now an official theological position rather than a radical individual claim. The young priest had been right about the framework, and they had been right about something else too, something harder to articulate, but that I had felt as clearly as I had felt anything. The relationship between the Verret and me had changed, not in the material facts of it. They still lived on me, still didn't collectively know what I was, still built their cities on my tendons and their temples on my kneecap, but in the quality of the daily life that I felt through the stone, something had shifted in the texture of it. It was subtle enough that I wasn't sure anyone could have named it from the inside, but from my position, feeling 500,000 people as weight and vibration and the accumulated patterns of their days, it was unmistakable. They were being more careful across the board, not scared, not walking on eggshells, just more careful, more consciously attentive. The stonemasons worked with a slightly different quality of attention than before, a little more consideration of what they were cutting into. The farmers tended the terraces with more deliberateness. The children played on the high ridges with more awareness of where they were standing. Small adjustments, barely perceptible, but consistent across the whole population and consistent with one thing, the emerging, collective, not yet named understanding that the ground might be paying attention, that it might matter, practically and morally, how you treated the very place where you lived your whole life. I found this more moving than almost anything that had happened in 5 centuries. Not the grand gestures, not Baran the Ninth placing his palm against the stone, not the young priest's 8 days of writing, the small adjustments, the stonemason being slightly more careful, the farmer taking a moment, the child hesitating at the edge before stepping back, the everyday weight of an entire population treating the place they lived as something that deserved genuine care and consideration. That was the thing I hadn't known I needed until I felt it. The thing that made 5 centuries of silence feel not wasted, but earned. On the 47th day after first contact, the Ashran named me. Not formally, not with ceremony. I don't think they had ceremonies for naming things that were already ancient. The Ashran mapper, the one I had watched systematically mapping the Eastern Titan's newly still geography, had crossed over to my side, was working through the same systematic attention on my body. I had been watching their movement with particular attention since I identified them. There was something in their quality of focus that reminded me of the young priest. The same deliberateness, the same willingness to stay with a question long past the point where most people moved on. They mapped for 3 weeks, every area of my body they could access, moving through the Verret cities and towns with a quiet that suggested they were observing rather than engaging. The Verret watched them with the specific mixture of wariness and fascination that all new things produced. Some soldiers followed at a distance. Some children also followed at a distance for entirely different reasons. The Ashran mappers seemed not to notice either group. They were attending to the stone. On the 21st day of their mapping, they climbed the eastern cliff, my arm, the path that the young priest had worn into a route over weeks of climbing. They reached the summit in the afternoon and found what was there, the clay tablets, the plant in the crack, the worn place where the young priest had sat. They spent time with each. I felt the attention, the quality of someone receiving something that had been left for a purpose, even if they didn't know what the purpose was. Then they sat down. In the same place the young priest always sat, facing east, toward the other Titan, toward the territory they had come from. And they spoke, aloud, not to anyone visible, to the stone. I couldn't hear words. I only ever felt the vibration of voice as pattern, as rhythm, as the shape of extended speech. But I felt this one clearly and with an attentiveness that surprised me. The quality of it was different from what the young priest did. Not writing out loud, not the rhythm of someone sharing composed thought, more like conversation. The rhythm of someone talking to someone else, expecting response. The pattern of a person who believed, without evidence but also without doubt, that they were being heard. I knocked once, as softly as I could, barely distinguishable from the natural settling of stone in temperature change. The mapper went completely still. Then, slowly, with the specific care of someone not wanting to disturb something delicate, pressed both palms flat against the stone. The same gesture, the young priest's gesture, which had been the Ashran elder's gesture, which had come from somewhere older than either of them, the gesture for, I am here. I know you're here. I'm not afraid. I held that contact carefully, let it last as long as they wanted. They stayed for a very long time, then spoke again, shorter this time. A few sounds, a brief pattern of voice, then lifted their hands and climbed back down. That evening, the other Titan knocked twice toward me. Presence, the weight of it was different from previous communication. Warmer, if that word means anything between beings of our scale. I knocked twice back. Presence acknowledged. I heard them. I know them now. The other Titan knocked once more. Acknowledgement. A resonance between us, like 2 strings tuned to the same frequency. The mapper had communicated what they found on my body, what I was, how I'd responded to their presence, that I was paying attention. The Titan had understood that the being on the other side of the field was not just large and old and rooted, that I was paying attention. I had been paying attention to every individual on the other Titan's body the same way I paid attention to the Verret, the same careful, accumulated, intimate knowledge, built from vibration and weight. But I hadn't had any way to communicate that across the distance. The mapper, through their visit and their voice, had given me one. The name they gave me, I learned later, was something that translated roughly as the one who remembers, or possibly the one who has been here long enough to know. The Ashran language apparently didn't make a useful distinction between those two meanings. They were the same concept to them. I liked that name. I'd been called many things by the Verret: the sacred terrain, the god's body, the eternal ground. Large things, abstract things. The Ashran gave me something specific and personal, not what I was in category terms, but what I did, the one who remembers. Yes, that was accurate. 5 centuries of paying attention had made me, more than anything else, a repository. A living record of every person who had ever walked on me, every season, every stone cut from my surface, every life born and ended in the cities on my body. The one who remembers. Yes, that. I held that name and felt it settle into me the way roots settle into stone. Slowly, permanently, with the patient intention of something that intends to stay. The spring continued without drama. The Verret prepared steadily for what was coming. The Ashran settled deeper into their new permanence. The fortification at my wrist had become something no one had planned and everyone had needed. A meeting place, not a military installation anymore, though the soldiers were still there. A trading post in the most literal sense. A place where 2 civilizations exchanged things. Not just goods, the Ashran's mobile crafts for the Verret's architecture, but also ideas, stories. The specific kind of knowledge that can only be acquired by living a life completely unlike the one you have lived. Ideas, stories. The specific kind of knowledge that can only be acquired by living a completely different kind of life from the one you've lived. The Ashran knew how to read moving ground. The Verret knew how to build on still ground. Both sets of knowledge were about to become urgently relevant. I had been thinking about the thing from the east with a different quality of attention since the other Titan had told me it had never been stopped. Not the frantic attention of someone trying to solve an impossible problem. More like the patient attention I applied to everything. The attention that doesn't require resolution to continue, that simply stays fully and completely present to whatever evidence arrives. I didn't know what it was. I still didn't know, despite everything. The other Titan's communications had given me scale and persistence and direction, but not nature. What I knew was that it displaced Titans. That in 2,000 years of motion it had not stopped. That it moved with the patient inevitability of something that had a direction and intended to follow it. Was it alive? Was it a being in the way I was a being with intentions and a history and something that might be called awareness? Or was it different, more like weather, like tectonic motion, like a force rather than any kind of creature with intentions? I didn't know. And the difference mattered enormously, because if it was a being, you could potentially communicate with it, reason with it, or at least acknowledge it. If it was a force rather than a being, you endured it or you didn't endure it. And the only question was what survived. I had been trying to determine which it was from the quality of the vibrations the other Titan sent me, from the shape of what they communicated about it over weeks of difficult exchange. What I had concluded, with the careful uncertainty I applied to all large conclusions, was both. It was both things simultaneously, something with direction, intention, persistence. Something that had been alive long enough that the distinction between force and being had stopped being meaningful. Something very, very old that had been moving in one direction for so long that the movement had become the thing itself. And it was still coming. On the 63rd day after first contact, I felt it for the first time directly, not through the other Titan's communications, through the Earth itself. A vibration at the very outer limit of my perception. Not seismic in the natural sense, not the random dispersal of geological activity. Something with direction. Something that originated from a single distant point in the east and radiated outward from that point in every direction. Like a heartbeat, massively slow, each pulse separated from the next by what I estimated at 6 hours of human time, but consistent, rhythmic, a heartbeat. Something very large, carrying a very slow heartbeat, still far away, but no longer beyond the outer edge of my direct perception. I knocked twice toward the eastern field, the signal for presence, then the complex signal I had developed for distance and direction, a rough language of geography. The other Titan understood immediately, knocked back in a pattern that I recognized as acknowledgement mixed with the quality I had come to associate with long familiarity. It had felt this heartbeat before, had been feeling it for 2,000 years, had organized its entire existence around the regular presence of that slow pulse in the eastern distance. For me, it was new. I cataloged it, added it to the inventory of everything I monitored, and returned my attention to the more immediate concerns of the present, the meetings at the fortification, the Ashran mapper working through my body, the plant on the cliff summit that had survived its first winter and was now growing with the specific confidence of something that had decided to stay, the young priest who had been given their new position and was now working within the Verret power structure rather than outside it, which meant both more access and more constraint. I watched them navigate that. The specific challenge of being inside an institution you are trying to change, you gain the ability to speak to people who would not otherwise listen. You lose the freedom to say things the institution is not yet capable of accommodating without fracturing around them. The young priest was good at this, better than I had expected. They had learned somewhere in the winter of disputation which fights to take and which to let go. The theology was developing into something that could survive institutional pressure, not compromised. The core of it, the thing that was actually true, the actual relationship between the living ground and the people who lived on it, that stayed completely intact, but translated, made legible to people who needed the vocabulary of their tradition to understand a new idea. The new framework was speaking Verret, even though it had started in a language the Verret had never used before. That translation work was harder than the original thinking. I watched it happen through the quality of the gatherings in the Citadel, the change in the weight of institutional meetings as the argument moved from radical to debated to simply present. On the 81st day, the other Titan sent me a complex signal, long and carefully structured, using the full vocabulary we had developed over weeks of exchange. I took 2 full days to parse it completely. I wanted to be certain I had understood correctly before I sent any response. What it communicated was a plan, not a plan for fighting. Neither of us knew what fighting the thing from the east would even mean. A plan for the people, for what should happen to the Verret and the Ashran when the thing arrived, regardless of what we did or didn't manage to do against it. The Ashran had done this before. Not survived a direct encounter. No one had. But survived the disruption of a Titan being forced to move suddenly, of geography changing without warning, of everything that had appeared permanent suddenly and without any warning becoming temporarily, catastrophically not. They knew how to survive that. Their whole culture was a record of how to survive that. 2,000 years of institutional knowledge about how to keep people alive when the ground stops being reliable. They were offering that knowledge to the Verret, not as charity, as exchange. The Verret knew how to build permanent things. The Ashran knew how to survive when permanent things stopped being permanent. Together, with both kinds of knowledge combined, they might be able to accomplish something neither could have managed alone. I held that plan inside me and felt it settle with the weight of something true, something that fit the actual shape of the situation rather than the shape we wished it had. This was what the fortification had been for all along. Not a military post, a place where 2 kinds of knowledge could begin to mix. I knocked twice. The strongest, clearest signal I had. Presence, understanding, agreement in the only language available to me. Then I did something I had not done in 5 centuries of lying still. I moved my other arm, the left one this time. Not toward anything, not as a gesture or a signal, as a fact, as a statement in stone about what I was and what I intended. I moved it slowly, over the course of a week, to a position that changed the shelter geometry of the northern settlements. Created a natural windbreak in an area that had always been exposed, small, practically invisible as a choice from any perspective except mine. The equivalent of adjusting your chair before settling in for a long wait. Settling in, making the space more livable, acting on the understanding that I was going to be here, and the people on me were going to be here, and I might as well be a better host. Born the Ninth felt it, of course. The northern cities felt it. The temple seismographers recorded it and debated it for days. The young priest, when they heard the reports, went to the northern settlements and stood in the new shelter of my arm and felt the difference in the wind. I know this because I felt them standing still, the way they always stood when they were receiving something. Not looking at anything in particular, just present in the changed air. They stayed there for a long time, receiving whatever they had come to receive. Then went back and wrote for 3 days straight. I didn't know what they wrote. I was beginning to make peace with not knowing. There were things that happened at the scale of human life that I could feel the shape of, but not the content. That was not a failure. That was the relationship. 2 kinds of existence, incommensurable in their scale, learning to communicate across a gap that could never be fully closed. The gap was not the problem to be solved. The gap was the actual substance of the relationship. Everything interesting lived in the gap. The summer of the first contact year was the most populated I had been since the plague had thinned the cities 3 centuries ago. New settlements were beginning at my shoulders, an area the Verret had always considered too exposed, too high, too close to the divine and therefore not suitable for ordinary habitation. Now they were building there. The altitude made sense for the storage facilities Boren was constructing. The exposure, which had always seemed like a danger, now seemed like an advantage. the long sight lines, the ability to see what was coming from a distance. The Ashran were helping with the construction. Their knowledge of building for impermanence, structures that could be dismantled and rebuilt quickly, that could absorb the stress of ground movement without catastrophic failure, was proving directly applicable to the Veret's needs. Two civilizations, learning from each other how to build for a future neither of them could fully predict. On the body of a being who was watching with the patient attention of something that had a great deal of practice at it. On the 89th day, the heartbeat from the east changed. Not in frequency, still 6 hours between pulses, but in amplitude, stronger, closer. I updated my estimation of arrival, not years, not decades, somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 years at current speed, which was long by human measure, but not by mine. 50 years was enough to build, to prepare, to move what needed moving and strengthen what needed strengthening. Not enough to be comfortable, not enough to assume the problem would solve itself, exactly enough to require that everyone work, that no one waited. I sent the updated estimation to the other Titan using our full vocabulary. It received it quietly, responded with one knock, acknowledgement, and then with two of presence. Here, staying, ready. I knocked twice back. The same, ready. The plant on my cliff was blooming, a small thing, a pale flower that the Veret's alpine varieties produced in high summer, barely visible against the stone. The young priest had come to the summit to see it. I knew because I felt them there, the familiar weight, the familiar stillness. They stayed at the summit for hours, the longest visit yet by a wide margin. I felt the quality of their presence differently this time, not questioning, not reaching towards something uncertain, just being there. Present with the stone, with the flower, with the morning, with me. I knocked once, so gently that I was not sure it would reach them at all, the softest signal I was capable of. They pressed their hand against the stone and held it there for a long time, not speaking, not writing, just their palm against my skin in the high summer morning. And I held it back, the whole weight of 5 centuries in that one point of contact. The river on my shin, and the seasons on my chest, and the fisher, and the stonemason, and the plague, and the civil war, and the F-47 kings, and every person who had ever been born and died in the cities on my body. All of it present in that one small warm palm, all of it saying the same thing. I'm still here. I have always been here. And I am going to be here, paying attention when whatever is coming finally arrives. Not because I am not afraid. I was, in whatever way a geological feature experiences something adjacent to fear. The heartbeat from the east was very real and very large and very persistent. Not because I was certain of the outcome. I was not. I had never been certain of anything except the quality of my own attention. But because the plant was blooming, because the young priest's palm was warm against my arm, because the other Titan was lying still in the field, and the Ashran were building their first permanent houses, and Reborn the Ninth was constructing permanent shelter on my shoulders for the overflow of people who would need it. Because 500,000 people were going about the ordinary business of their lives, getting up in the morning, tending their fields, arguing with their neighbors, watching sunsets from high places. Because all of that ordinary, unremarkable, impossible life was happening on me. Because I had become, without asking or planning, the place where it happened. And that was worth holding, worth staying for, worth whatever was coming. I am the one who remembers, the one who has been here long enough to know. And here's what I know, after 5 centuries of silence and 50 years of slowly learning that stillness is not absence. Everything that lives on you changes you. Every road cut through your stone, every foundation set against your bones, every generation born and dying in the cities on your body, all of it leaves something. The Veret had built themselves into me, and I had built myself into them, and neither of us had noticed it happening until it was already complete. That is not a tragedy. That is the only way any of it works. The only way that two things become responsible for each other. Not through choice, not through agreement, through time, through proximity, through the slow and patient and unstoppable accumulation of shared presence over many generations. Whatever was coming from the east, it was going to meet something it had not met before. Not a running Titan and a fleeing civilization. Not an empty landscape. Something rooted. Something that had been paying attention for a very long time and intended to keep paying attention. Something with a plant blooming on its highest cliff and a young priest who climbed up every week to check on it. Something with 500,000 people who were beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to know what they were living on. I knocked twice into the ground. The way I had knocked when I made my choice about staying. The way I had knocked when the other Titan lay down. The way I had knocked when I understood, finally, that this was my life and I had been living it without fully knowing it. Presence. I am here. This is what I am. Whatever comes next, and I do not know what comes next, I want to be clear about that. I will be present for it. Paying attention. The sun moved across my chest. The cities woke up. The young priest climbed back down the cliff with the unhurried step of someone who would be back tomorrow. The heartbeat from the east continued its slow measured pulse into the autumn air, far away, incredibly patient, still coming. And I lay in the morning and held my ground and felt the weight of everything I had been given without asking and chose, for the 10,000th time, to hold it. I'm still here. I remember everything. And I'm not done yet. There's something I want to tell you about the nature of this kind of existence that I didn't understand at the beginning and took centuries to lear in. When I first became aware of my situation, enormous, immobile, geological, lying in the dark with a river running down my shin, I thought the central fact of my life was the limitation, that I could not move, that I could not speak, that I could not act in any of the ways that had given human life its shape. The limitation seemed like the whole story, the tragedy of it, the vast, patient, empty tragedy of being this much and doing this little. I was wrong, not about the facts. The limitation was real. I was wrong about what the central fact was. The central fact was not the limitation. The central fact was the attention. What 500 years of enforced stillness had given me was not a record of all the things I could not do. It had given me an extraordinary, comprehensive, intimate, and comprehensive knowledge of everything that had ever happened within my considerable and long-established reach. I knew the Verret better than any Verret had ever known themselves. Not any individual Verret. I couldn't know any individual fully. The scale between us was too large. But the civilization, the shape of it, the way it breathed. I had felt every major event in their 5 centuries as a change in the pattern of daily life on my body. The plague as a terrible thinning. The Civil War as a disruption that healed. The contact with the Torath as an enrichment. The arrival of the Ashran as the largest disruption yet, and the one that had finally, after all this time, produced a response in me rather than just a record. I had not been passive. I want to be clear about that. I had been present. Fully, continuously, completely present to everything that happened on me and around me. That is not the same as passive. Passive means not engaged. Passive means nothing you do or don't do makes a difference. That was not my situation. My situation was everything I did made an enormous difference, so I did as little as possible, as carefully as possible, while maintaining total awareness of everything. That is not passivity. That is the most demanding possible form of engagement. The attention required to be large enough to make an impact with every breath, and still and careful enough not to, but I don't know how many Titans there are in the world. The other Titan was the only one I had encountered directly, though its history suggested others might exist in regions neither of us had knowledge of. I don't know if all of them live as I had lived. Stillness chosen as protection. Attention as the only available form of engagement. But I suspect that most things with enough presence to change the world choose stillness at some point. That it is not weakness. That it is, in fact, the only way to stay long enough to matter. The thing from the east had not been still. It had been in motion for longer than I had been still, and it had become the kind of thing that motion produces over that kind of time. A force, a direction, a persistence. I had become something else, something that motion doesn't produce because motion doesn't allow for it. A place, a home, a geography that 500,000 people had built their entire understanding of the world upon. That distinction, force versus place, was going to matter when it arrived. I was sure of that, even without knowing the details. A force moves through places. It does not know how to respond to something that simply is. I had been simply being for a very long time. I was very good at it. On the 95th day after first contact, Boran IX came to the eastern cliff alone. No escort, no soldiers, just the king, walking through the lower city at dawn before anyone was awake. I tracked him from the moment he left the citadel. The specific weight of his movement was familiar to me now. I had spent months learning to distinguish it from everyone else's. He walked through the lower city to the base of the eastern cliff and stood at the bottom of it for a while, looking up. Then he began to climb. Not with the young priest's practiced ease. Boran IX was not a climber, and I could feel every careful, uncertain step. But he climbed anyway, steady and careful and persistent, which was, I had decided, the way he did everything. He reached the summit, stood there in the early morning with the sun just clearing the eastern horizon and the other Titan's territory visible below him. He stood for a long time. I had the impression he was seeing something that he had been seeing in his mind for months and was now finally seeing with his actual eyes. Then he walked to the worn place near the cliff edge where the young priest always sat, and he sat down in it. And he stayed there, the way the young priest stayed, not as ceremony, not as ritual, just staying, being on the highest point of his kingdom at dawn, with the ground solid beneath him and everything he was responsible for visible below. I knocked once, the softest signal I had, barely more than the natural settling of warm stone in cool air. Boran IX went still, then placed his hand against the stone, not the two-palm deliberate gesture of the young priest or the elder. One hand, fingers spread, like someone steadying themselves, like someone making contact with something they weren't sure was there, but choosing to make the contact anyway, choosing to act on the assumption of presence. I held that hand as carefully as I had ever held anything. The hand of the man who was responsible for the 500,000 lives on my body, making contact with the fact of what he was responsible for. He stayed until the sun was high, then climbed back down. I felt him reach the lower city and disappear into the rhythm of its morning. He never came back to the summit. One visit, one hand on the stone, one held moment at the beginning of a day that went on to contain counsels and decisions and the ordinary work of governance. But the quality of those counsels and decisions, for the rest of the year, felt different to me, heavier, more considered. He had felt me, and he had made his choice about what to do with that feeling, which was to keep doing the work, to take it seriously, to use the time. I respected that enormously. Autumn came. The Ashran celebrated it in a way the Verret did not. A specific gathering, a specific quality of organized presence that lasted 3 days. I'd never felt anything like it from the Verret. Not quiet prayer, not formal ceremony, something more immediate, more joyful. The specific weight of a large group of people who had decided that right now, this moment, this exact configuration of being alive together, deserved acknowledgement. They had survived another full year on still ground for the first time in memory. The ground had held. They were all here. The celebration had a quality of relief in it that I recognized from the inside. The relief of something that had expected catastrophe and found instead continuity. The Verret watched from the fortification. Some of them stayed 3 days. I felt the mixing of the patterns, Verret soldiers and Ashran celebrants occupying the same territory with different but compatible guys. By the 3rd day, some of the Verret were participating, not formally, as they didn't know the forms, but present in the space of it, there in the warmth of a celebration that wasn't theirs but that had room for them. That was when I understood what the next generation would look like. Not a merger, not an erasure of difference, something more interesting. 2 civilizations that had learned to occupy the same space while remaining themselves. 2 peoples who had developed, through proximity and shared danger and the unavoidable fact of living next to each other, the specific kind of respect that comes from knowing someone well enough to disagree with them and remain present anyway. Not the same, never the same. The Verret would build and the Ashran would move, and the ground between them would be a permanent negotiation. But together, sharing the same geography, carrying the same knowledge about what was in it and what it required from them. On the 103rd day, the young priest came to the summit and sat with the plant for a while and then spoke for a long time. I felt the full length of it, the longest I had heard from them. An hour, maybe more. The rhythm of someone who had been thinking for months and had finally arrived at something they could say. Then they went completely quiet for a long time, sat there in the mountain silence, then placed both palms flat against the stone. I knocked twice, strong and clear and without any of the usual care to minimize impact. 2 full, deliberate knocks that the seismographers would record and the priests would interpret and the king would note in his morning report. 2 knocks. Presence. I am here. I hear you. I have always heard you. I'm staying. I remember. The young priest kept their hands on the stone until the knocking stopped resonating, then sat back, looked out at the eastern field for a long time, then said something short, a few sounds, the pattern of a conclusion, something that had been thought about for a long time arriving at its final form. I couldn't hear it. I will never know exactly what they said, but I felt the shape of it, the quality of it, the weight of someone who had been paying attention for years, addressing the thing they had been paying attention to. And I answered the only way I knew how. Once, 1 knock, soft and certain and complete, acknowledgement. I hear you. I know you. You're not alone in this. You never were. The sun moved across my chest. Far away, the slow heartbeat of the east continued its patient count. The plant on the cliff was going to seed now, preparing for winter, preparing to reproduce. Below me, in 6 cities and 14 towns and hundreds of villages, 500,000 people were living their ordinary, extraordinary lives. The Ashran were building their 2nd row of permanent houses. Born the 9th was reviewing plans for the shoulder settlements. The mapper was somewhere on my upper back, cataloging terrain. The other Titan lay in the field to the east, still and patient and no longer running, carrying its civilization into permanence for the first time in 2,000 years. And I lay beneath all of it, the place where it happened, the one who remembered. I had been here before any of this. I would be here after things none of us could predict. But right now, in this specific autumn of the first contact year, with this plant going to seed and the cities full and the young priest sitting at the top of my arm in the afternoon light, right now, everything was exactly where it should be. I knocked twice, into the ground, into no one in particular, just saying it to the earth, to the roots of the plant, to the 5 centuries of silence that had produced this. Still here, still holding, still paying attention. The east answered, distant and slow, one knock, far away, soft as the settling of a continent into its bed. I know, so am I. And that was enough. That was everything. The world went about its business, the sun reached the horizon. Somewhere in the lower city, a child was born. I felt it as the particular quality of new weight, small and complete and absolutely certain of its own existence, entering the pattern for the first time. Welcome, I said, in the only language I had. 2 knocks, barely perceptible, into the ground beneath the street where they were born. I'm glad you're here. This is a good place. I've been here a very long time, and I intend to keep making sure it holds. There is one more thing I want to tell you. One thing I kept back, not because it was unimportant, but because it needed all the rest of this to make sense. On the 43rd day after first contact, I moved my right hand, not my arm, the arm I had already repositioned, the barrier between the approaching Titan and my ribs, my hand, the finger specifically. I extended the index finger of my right hand by approximately 1 careful degree. I did this deliberately, with full awareness of the consequences. 1 degree of finger extension, in a hand the size of a mountain range, does not pass unnoticed. The valley that had been in the crook of that finger, a small valley, not heavily settled, mostly farmland and a few outlying villages, suddenly became different. The angle of the valley walls changed. The way the wind moved through it changed. The light in the morning hours changed. A small valley that had been pleasant became something better, more sheltered, more productive, a natural place, suddenly improved. The farmers in that valley would have noticed immediately, not understood. They would have attributed it to a shift in the seasonal weather patterns, perhaps, or to some geological activity, but noticed. And the harvests in that valley, for the next several seasons, were better than they had been for the 5 centuries before. I had done that, deliberately, for no strategic reason, not preparation, not communication, just because I could. Because I was here and they were here, and the angle had always been slightly suboptimal in a fixable way, and now it wasn't. That was the moment I understood what the rest of this existence was going to look like. Not the waiting for the thing from the east, not the diplomacy between civilizations, the small adjustments, the valley angle, the windbreak at the northern settlements, the stable crack where the plant could grow, the 10,000 invisible, uncredited, unacknowledged choices I was going to make for as long as I existed, on behalf of the people who lived on me and would never know I was making them. That was the job. Not the dramatic choices. Those mattered, but they were rare. The job was the ongoing, patient, daily attention to everything that lived on me, and the small adjustments that genuine attention made possible. The job, stated simply, was being a good place to live. Not a perfect place. Not a safe one. The heartbeat from the east was proof enough that safety was never guaranteed. Not a place without difficulty or loss, or the ordinary suffering that life produces, regardless of what the ground is doing. Just a place that was better for my being attentive to it. A place that held a little more steadily because something was paying attention. I could do that. I had been doing that in a limited and unintentional way for 5 centuries. I could do it deliberately now, and I could do it for a long time, however long was needed, however long the plant grew and the city stood and the young priest kept climbing the cliff. However many years the slow heartbeat from the east took to finally arrive at my border, I would be here either way. The autumn deepened. The first frost settled on my upper body, the thin, high-altitude kind that disappears by mid-morning. The city settled into winter patterns. The Asheron's celebration had ended, and they had gone back to the ongoing work of permanence. The fortification was busy with the two-way traffic that had become its normal state. Borin the Ninth was preparing for winter councils. The young priest was writing, always writing, now. The mapper was back on the Eastern Titan, presumably applying exactly the same systematic and careful attention to that body that they had applied to mine. The other Titan was still, the most still it had been in 2,000 years. The stillness of something that had finally allowed itself to rest. I thought about that a lot. 2,000 years of running. And then one day, because of a conversation in a language made of seismic patterns and careful attention, choosing to stop. It had been possible the whole time. The stopping had always been available. It had just required believing that something would hold the ground while you rested. I was holding the ground. That was what I was doing. That was what I had always been doing, even before I understood it. The ground holder. The one who remembers. The place that held. Not a bad set of names for something that started as a data analyst with a dead succulent and an ordinary life in an ordinary city. The universe still had a sense of humor, but I had decided, sometime in the long stretch of 5 centuries and 50 days and all the things that had happened in between, that I liked the joke, that I would stay for the punchline, whatever it turned out to be. The sun moved, the city woke up. Somewhere on the eastern cliff, the plant swayed in the morning wind. I was here.